I've done some dumb things, and I'll do dumb things again.
And it should be noted, and I hope you all are duly impressed with the fact that I'm one of the most powerful men in the United States. And you ladies, are you aware of that? Just how powerful I am? I am number 100 in seniority, and don't forget it. To give you an idea of the extent of my power, I'd like to tell you a little thing that happened to me a couple months ago. This young lady knows I'm so powerful she wants to get close to me. She just moved right up front here. Probably has one zinger of a question when I'm finished. You know, down in the Senate there are certain things that are reserved for senators only. From bathrooms to elevators to subway cars to barber shops to gymnasiums, and they're all appropriately marked. They say, senators only. Well, you know, being a 30-year-old upstart, I felt a little self-conscious about exercising my senatorial prerogatives. And so the first month or so, I didn't use any of them, especially the elevator. Being a man of the people, I rode with the press, and you can't get much lower than riding with the press. And I used their elevator. Well, their elevator, these days anyway, is just as slow as all the other elevators in the Capitol. And again, because of my importance, I have one of the largest offices in Washington. My office is as far away from the Senate floor as you can possibly get and still be in the District of Columbia. The bell, you know, we have these fancy clocks in our offices, or most senators do, I don't. My secretary has one, but my office doesn't have one. And the bells ring indicating how much time you have to respond to vote. And the 5-minute bell went off without my having heard the 15-minute bell. My secretary came around the corner and said, Senator, I'm sorry, I forgot to tell you the bell went off. There's a vote on the floor. You have 5 minutes to make it. And as far away from the floor as I am, it literally takes 5 minutes to get there. So I went running down the corridor, turned around the corner, and for the first time, I had the gumption to push that button that said, for senators only. Press the button, young man comes bobbing up to the 6th floor. Doors pop open, I start to walk in, he put his hand out. It's honest to God truth. I said, what's the matter? He leaned out and he said, can't you read? It says, senators only. Well, what do? Do you go, oh, I'm a senator at that point? So the only response that I could come up with was that I said, well, my name's Joe Biden. I said, my name's Joe Biden, and I'm from Delaware. By this time, he's back in the elevator, starting down. I literally jumped in the elevator, and I said, look, fella, I said, I've got to get to the subway and get to the Senate floor to vote. I am a senator. By the time we got from the 6th to the 3rd floor, and you could see it running through his mind, is it possible, he turned and looked at me, and his only comment was, you've got to be kidding. Well, I am happy to announce to you today that he's been fired. And he'll never sass me back again. But I do applaud your judgment of inviting someone as powerful, influential, and as knowledgeable as me to speak to you. Because from what I heard at the table today, you need all the education you can get. But I don't think anything has assaulted the system and the fundamental makeup of this country as much as this Watergate thing has. And the only analogy I can really think of is a football analogy, and I apologize to you women in the audience for not being able to think of a more appropriate analogy, but they told me here they didn't want you here anyway. I didn't expect any women to be here. Is that right, Mr. President? No. I put down the speech that my staff had labored on and got up and gave a 20-minute tirade, 15 minutes of which was devoted to the virtues of the Republican Party. And I think they were shocked that at a Democratic fundraiser, I'd tell them of the virtues of the Republican Party. But if those of you who are active Democrats in the audience are too short-sighted to realize that the demise of the Republican Party means your own demise, that the demise of politicians and political parties means the demise of the system, then one of us is very stupid, either you or me. What ties us together are the political institutions that have made this country great. We spend a lot of time talking about the United States being a melting pot. Well, that's true, but quite frankly, I think it's overrated. We've been able to move forward because of politics. And in my opinion, politics need not necessarily be a dirty word. Politics should be the most honorable of professions. Those of you who are doctors and lawyers and Indian chiefs in the audience, how can any of you possibly do as much good if you're very good at what you do as I can do if I'm very good at what I can do? You can't. Had in the beginning when I started, big corporations or big labor or big wealthy individuals or big anybody come along and said, here, Biden, we want to contribute $20,000 to you, I probably would have taken it. Not probably, I would have taken it. By the way, let me make it clear. The Democratic administration, the last one from what I'm told, was just as secretive and just as uncooperative as this administration is. As I said, I think power tends to, if not corrupt, at least centralize. And were I president, I might not, and by the way, I will not run if nominated, and if elected, I will not serve. Were I president, I might very well want to, let me put it this way. If we elect a, quote, liberal Democratic senator next time around, or president next time around, I have no confidence whatsoever that the thing will change one little bit. Yes, sir, ma'am.
Yeah, Senator, I find you very articulate. May I ask
I find you
to
very
the best...
lovely. Come on up front.
The rest is not very good.
That's what I thought. That's why I tried to compliment you. I thought I'd scare you out of it.
To the best of your knowledge, Senator, do you believe that the Democratic Party has ever been involved in something as atrocious as bugging?
Sure, yes. Yes, I do. But bugging isn't the question, kiddo. We're not even talking about bugging. The rumor was that Robert Kennedy used to walk into his office in the morning when he was a senator and pick up the phone and say, hello, everybody, how are you? And the counter to that was, the reason he was able to pick it up and say that is when he was Attorney General, he was doing the bugging. So, I'm sure that bugging has gone on. And I'm sure, and that's offensive to everyone. It's particularly offensive to somebody like me who's being bugged, if I am. But as one of my colleagues said, Joe, you're not important enough yet to be bugged, so don't worry about it. He's probably right. But really and truly, it has gone on. But I don't know that there's been such an assault on the system before. I don't think there's been such an overall comprehensive plan of such magnitude as to completely eliminate the fields to begin with, number one, and number two, to subvert the whole process. I don't think it's been done on that grand a scale. Let me say for the record, clearly, Democrats are as immoral as Republicans, and maybe in big cities a good deal more immoral in the traditional sense. But as a practical matter, politicians as a whole, in my opinion, having practiced law for 4 years, are a good deal more moral than lawyers, for example, or doctors, or businessmen as a whole. So, we're no different. She's better looking than you, Judge. We'll go to... Well, the fortunate thing is I didn't have many larger contributors, and the only reason... See, I went to the big guys for the money. I was ready to prostitute myself in the manner in which I talk about it. But what happened was they said, come back when you're 40, son. And there are those of we social planners who think somehow that if we just subrogate man's individual characteristics and traits by making sure that presently a heterogeneous society becomes a totally homogeneous society, that somehow we're going to solve our social ills. And quite to the contrary. I think the concept of busing, which implicit in that concept is the question you just asked, or the statement within the question you just asked, that we
we are going to integrate people so that they all have the same access and they learn to grow up with one another and all the rest, is a rejection of the whole movement of black pride, is a rejection of the entire black awareness concept, where black is beautiful, black culture should be studied, and a cultural awareness of the importance of their own identity, their own individuality. And I think that's a healthy, solid proposal.
The way I answer that is I predict that the young black leadership of America will overwhelmingly decide with me. I predict that in 1980 and 84, my position will be totally vindicated by the sociologists and by the civil rights advocates. You know, I come from that side of the track. That's where I'm from. I was a defense lawyer. I handled civil rights cases. I sat in on Route 40. I mean, I'm not from the other side of this. And I happen to think that the one way to ensure that you set the civil rights movement in America further back is to continue to push busing, because it's a bankrupt policy. And that's why I think I'll be vindicated.
President Roosevelt clearly had the right to send to the United States Senate and the United States Congress a proposal to pack the court. It was totally within his right to do that. He violated no law. He was legalistically absolutely correct, but it was a bonehead idea. It was a terrible, terrible mistake to make, and it put in question, for an entire decade, the independence of the most significant body, including the Congress, in my view, the most significant body in this country, the Supreme Court of the United States of America. The President had the right to do that. He was totally within his power, and his objective was seen clearly. When I was 17 years old, I participated in sit-ins to desegregate restaurants and movie houses in my state, and my stomach turned upon hearing the voices of Faubus and Barnett, and my soul raged upon seeing the dogs of Bull Connor. And when I was 25 years of age, I stood beside a railroad track in Wilmington, Delaware, with my sister Valerie, and openly wept as Robert F. Kennedy's funeral train passed by. But now, at the age of 40, as a Democratic leader of the Judiciary Committee, as the leader of that committee, I had to be reminded that Mississippi still has a dual registration system for voting. Here I became involved in politics because of civil rights, and now I'm a force in politics in spite of mounting civil wrongs. Will they heed the voices in our party who say, much progress has been made. We must now wait for the Reagan Revolution to play itself out. To those voices I say, we cannot wait, or our soul will be corrupted by our silence.
The fact of the matter is that he said we're making progress, but I don't see that progress. When I came to the United States Senate 11 years ago, I swore I'd never vote to send a fighting man anywhere in the world unless two conditions prevail. The first being a clear definition of the purpose, and the second one being that we had full faith and credit of the United States behind that fighting man. Neither of those conditions prevail today, and I think the president who says America's back still has Marines in Lebanon. It's time to bring those Marines back, and it's time for us to have a coherent foreign policy. We don't have one.
They say you and your record can't take the heat. How would you react to that?
Well, I guess the first part of the answer would be you heard his opening statement. I think that's probably one of the most unique opening statements I've heard in a debate anywhere in the country. And I can't ever recall a campaign in the state of Delaware where one major candidate for public office said the other person just flat out lacks the character. Quite frankly, were this not a political debate, I suspect John and I would go behind the barn and work this out.
Those keys, Charles J. Schmedlap from Shuswicki. Stand up. Now, the next man I'd like you to meet, y'all got to sit down for this because y'all going to stand up. We're going to have some important people coming out in a minute, but there's one more band member that I want you to meet. Ladies and gentlemen, our vocalist tonight, Michael Jackson. Michael, would you please stand? Thank you. Thank you very much. Soon to become Prince, as I was just pointed out to me.
It would be very hard for me to go out and make the case for my president that I had strong disagreement with. That'd be a hard thing for me to do. And I don't criticize those who do, because you must be a team. So I would not recommend that anyone pick me for vice president.
If we look at the Middle East, I think it's about time we stop, those of us who support, as most of us do, Israel in this body, for apologizing for our support for Israel. There's no apology to be made. None. It is the best $3 billion investment we make. Were there not an Israel, the United States of America would have to invent an Israel to protect her interest in the region. The United States would have to go out and invent an Israel.
Let me ask you a couple questions. You think judicial activism, Doctor, has hurt blacks. Judicial activism of eliminating restrictive covenants in deeds, eliminating segregation in schools, one man, one vote, literacy test. Do you consider those judicially active?
Well, as regards restrictive covenants, I can see no evidence that they did anything other than make some people feel good because it was symbolic. As regards desegregation of the school system, that should have been done long before and on a much more sound basis. I've gone into this at great length in previous writings.
But are they...
No, you see, the problem is not whether you believe that school desegregation should have ended. I believe it should have ended long before.
Okay.
George Bork believes it should have ended long before. What he and what I have objected to are the principles used in that decision, because those principles take on a life of their own, and they come back to haunt you in other areas. Obviously, this old phrase, the hard cases make bad law, derived from that fact. You dream up a principle to reach this result, and then the principle has a life of its own.
So the principle of desegregating the schools...
No, that wasn't the principle. The principle was the reason that they picked for it was...
Well, that's all I'm saying. Okay, the reasons they picked...
Yes.
Desegregating the schools, you and Judge Bork agree, were the wrong principles, and they should have not... So the court shouldn't have done that.
No, the court should have done it.
Oh, okay.
Both of us have said the court should have done it.
I see.
And in my case, and I think in his case, the court should have done it a lot sooner.
How?
They should have ruled that it wasn't equal protection of the law, because nobody in his right mind believes that there was equal protection of the law in the Jim Crow era of these school systems.
I'm just trying to figure out what you're saying.
Yes.
Now, when they desegregated the D.C. schools, it's clear the 14th Amendment does not apply. Everyone agrees that the 14th Amendment does not apply to the District of Columbia. How would they have done it in the District of Columbia? Should they have just let it stand in the District of Columbia? Segregation?
No, in fact, Senator, it's interesting that you say that, because I've gotten the first thing I ever wrote in on a public issue was in November 13th, 1950, in the Washington Star, in which I argued for the desegregation of the D.C. school system. So that
on what principle?
I had not studied nearly as much then as I have 37 years later, and so I hadn't worked it out. Nor do I think that I would want to work it out on the run in front of a large group of lawyers at this very moment in the time that's available.
Well, how about literacy test? Was it judicial?
I see no reason why people shouldn't be literate in order to vote. The question is, if you have a black who comes in with his degree from Harvard, and the man behind the desk says, no, you're not literate, you can't vote, then you see, this is what bothers me. People are talking about how judges should be sensitive to this particular group or that particular group. And if that means anything, if it means he's applying the law differently, that's precisely how blacks were held down for generations in the South.
So
by
literacy
applying the law differently.
So literacy test, as long as they were equally applied, are all right.
Sure.
So I thought you thought. Now, I also want to clarify, I gather from your comments about MIT and Harvard that you don't think there's enough blacks out there who are qualified to fill the number of vacancies allotted for them in those schools. Is that right? Is that what you're saying?
Well, the word qualified really is misleading.
Well,
the question is whether or not they are like the other students at Harvard and MIT.
Well, okay. Well, so there's not...
So they may be perfectly qualified. This same student might go through, God help us, I hope there's nobody here from Illinois, Illinois Institute of Technology and do well. But there's no reason why he should fail at MIT. There's no prestige in flunking out of the Ivy League.
I got it. So, but my point is, you believe there are not enough black women and men out there that are the same as white women and men to be able to go through Harvard and MIT.
If there were, it would mean that the whole history of oppression had done no harm whatever.
Well, so the answer is you don't think there are. I just want to figure out what you're saying.
It's not a question of what I think. It's a factual matter.
So factually, you're saying factually there are not enough.
Factually, this study's already been done by Clickguard at Harvard, and the figures are all there. Anyone can look them up.
Okay. No, I just want to hear from you. I want to know what you're thinking. Have you read all of Judge Bork's cases or any of them? Have you read all of his writings?
I haven't read all of them, but I've been reading them for more than 20 years because I used to teach antitrust economics.
Now, are you part of what they call the law and economics school? You know that? Would you consider yourself part of that school? There's nothing wrong with that. It's not a bad school. I just want to know where you are.
When I sit down to write, Senator, I don't ask what my label. I don't check my identification tag to see what I am. But I did. One of my books did win a prize as the best book in law and economics in 1980.
Yeah, no, but I mean, there's almost a term of art out there called the School of Law and Economics. Yes. And are you part of that school intellectually? That's all I'm trying to get.
I'm very much interested in the application of economic principles in the law and vice versa.
Right. Now, my time's up. When I marched in the civil rights movement, I marched with tens of thousands of others to change attitudes. And by the way, I know everyone in my generation is supposed to be only interested in BMWs and MBAs, and they don't care about anything, so we're told. Let me remind some of you that in 1960, they said the same thing. There was no great movement on the campuses in 1959 and 58 and 60. I came out of the civil rights movement. I was one of those guys that sat in and marched and all that stuff. But no one was moving then. But somebody came along and struck the match that kindled the bonfire. You had a follow-up question, and I'll take this lady right here.
Senator, I have one real quick question. What law school did you attend, and where did you place in that class? And the other question is, could you quickly, I think
I probably have a much higher IQ than you do, I suspect. I went to law school on a full academic scholarship, the only one in my class to have a full academic scholarship. In the first year in law school, I decided I didn't want to be in law school and ended up in the bottom two-thirds of my class, and then decided I wanted to stay, went back to law school, and in fact ended up in the top half of my class. I won the international moot court competition. I was the outstanding student in the political science department at the end of my year. I graduated with 3 degrees from undergraduate school and 165 credits, only need 123 credits, and I'd be delighted to sit down and compare my IQ to yours if you'd like, Frank.
If I could say one thing.
Biden now concedes he did not graduate in the top half of his law school class, that he does not have 3 degrees from college, and that he was not named outstanding political science student in college.
Cannot measure the health of our children.
The health of our children.
The quality of our education.
The quality of their education.
The joy of their play.
Or the joy of their play.
Biden gave Kennedy no credit. He has also quoted or paraphrased John Kennedy, Hubert Humphrey, and British Labour Party leader Neil Kinnock, all without credit.
Why am I the first Kinnock in 1,000 generations to be able to get to university?
I started thinking as I was coming over here, why is it that Joe Biden is the first in his family ever to go to a university?
Why is Glenys the first woman in her family in 1,000 generations to be able to get to university?
Why is it that my wife, who's sitting out there in the audience, is the first in her family to ever go to college?
Is it because all our predecessors were thick? Did they lack talent? Those people who could sing and play and recite and write poetry?
Is it because our fathers and mothers were not bright? Is it because I'm the first Biden in 1,000 generations to get a college and a graduate degree that I was smarter than the rest? Those same people who read poetry and wrote poetry and taught me how to sing verse?
But why didn't they get it? Was it because they were weak? Those people who could work 8 hours underground and then come up and play football? Weak.
Is it because they didn't work hard? My ancestors who worked in the coal mines in northeast Pennsylvania and come up after 12 hours and play football for 4 hours?
Does anybody really think that they didn't get what we had because they didn't have the talent or the strength or the endurance or the commitment? Of course not. It was because there was no platform upon which they could stand.
No, it's not because they weren't as smart. It's not because they didn't work as hard. It's because they didn't have a platform upon which to stand.
The notion that every thought or notion or idea you'd have to go back and find and attribute to someone, I think is, quite frankly, ludicrous. I should have said, to paraphrase Neil Kinnock, it's the only time I didn't.
Biden was then asked what effect these allegations would have on his presidential campaign.
I don't think it will have any effect, but I don't know. You all will make the judgment about that. It'll all depend on how you write it. I don't mean that. I'm not being smart. It'll all depend on the American people looking at me. They're going to look at me and say, is Joe Biden being honest with me? Or is Joe Biden not being honest with me? I'm being honest.
Every president for the past 2 decades, Democrat and Republican alike, has declared war on drugs. And each of them has lost that war and lost it miserably. They lost because they attempted to deal with only part of the drug problem. They lost because their initiatives were pulled apart by bureaucratic squabbling among their advisors. They lost because they always did too little and they did it too late. That's why the Democrats and Republicans in the Congress got together last year to write the law that required the president to give us a national drug strategy. The one you heard tonight. You heard him deliver it. We don't oppose the president's plan. All we want to do is strengthen it. We don't doubt his resolve. All we want to do is stiffen it. The trouble is that the president's proposals are not big enough to deal with the problem. His rhetoric isn't matched by the resources we need to get the job done. Quite frankly, the president's plan's not tough enough, bold enough, or imaginative enough to meet the crisis at hand. If you had a child in your family that was seriously ill, I doubt whether you'd call a family meeting to discuss what percentage of the family budget you were willing to spend to make him well. You wouldn't say that we can't afford to spend more than a penny out of every dollar the family has to cure the child. But that's exactly what the president would have us do. Spend one penny out of every tax dollar to fight drugs. The Defense Department spends $300 billion a year to prepare for a war we hope we'll never have to fight. But the president says he wants to spend only $8 billion next year on a war we're already fighting and we're losing. The president says he wants to wage a war on drugs, but if that's true, what we need is another D-Day, not another Vietnam, not another limited war fought on the cheap and destined for stalemate and human tragedy. Now I'm going to point out some specific things, 6 of them, that we find inadequate about the president's plan. I think the president has to join us in making a significantly greater commitment to these 6 areas to stem the rising tide of violence in America, and that's what it is, violence. First, we have to join together to ensure that drug dealers are punished swiftly, surely, and severely. And in line with what the president is calling for, we have to hold every drug user accountable. Because if there were no drug users, there would be no appetite for drugs and there'd be no market for them. Let's take a look at what the real problem is. It's not just how many people are using drugs. As the president said, the number of people using drugs, cocaine in particular, is down in our country. That's true. But the violence associated with drugs is spewing out all over America. And that's terrible. I know it's hard to believe, but this very day, violent drug offenders will commit more than 100,000 crimes on this day alone. And the sad part is that we have no more police in the streets of our major cities than we had 10 years ago. And what the president proposes won't help much. What he proposes is no increase over what the Congress has already approved last year. In a nutshell, the president's plan doesn't include enough police officers to catch the violent thugs, not enough prosecutors to convict them, not enough judges to sentence them, and not enough prison cells to put them away for a long time. That's why right now, 6 out of every 10 criminals who are arrested on drug charges have their cases dropped. That's why we think the president should triple the commitment that he's made tonight for police, prosecutors, and judges for our cities and our states. Second, education. The president says he's increasing money for drug education because he knows what we know. It works. We found out that when students understand how harmful cocaine is, they're 5 times less likely to even try the drug. And right now, the drug education message is reaching only 50% of the children in this country. And the president's plan, for all the talk, will only increase our efforts by 5%. You know, drug education is the only vaccine we have against the drug abuse among our young. And can you imagine me sitting before you and saying, we're only going to vaccinate 50% of the children against polio or smallpox? We have to do more. We have to educate our children about the dangers of drugs. We have to start in kindergarten, because we know that last year, 1 out of every 4 high school students in America tried drugs, and that the other 3 were prime targets of drug pushers. We can't afford to lose a generation while we're sorting out the budgetary priorities of this nation. We must do more, and now. Third, we disagree with the president's decision to cut back on our previous commitment to protect against drugs coming across the border, to cut the Customs Service, the Coast Guard, and the Border Patrol. We think we should do more to stem the flow of drugs across our borders, and we think we should go one step further. Let's go after the drug lords where they live, with an international strike force. There must be no safe haven for these narco-terrorists, and they must know it. Fourth, the experts tell us there are 6.5 million addicts, addicted drug addicts out there, and that they're committing thousands upon thousands of crimes. And under the president's plan, we'll treat only 19 out of 100 addicts. He talked about pregnant women. Well, his proposal would help only 1/4 of the children under the age of 16 who are addicted, and 1/4 of the women who are pregnant and addicted. We can do better than that to prevent the next generation from becoming a generation of violence. Fifth, the president has to take charge and end the bureaucratic infighting that plagues the anti-drug efforts now. Last year, for example, and listen to this, last year the Congress approved $5 million to protect Colombian judges, providing the kind of support that the Colombian Justice Minister, Mrs. de Grief, recently asked for in Washington. Yet not a single penny of that $5 million arrived in Bogota, Colombia, before the Justice Minister arrived in the United States a couple weeks ago. And the president's plan does nothing to prevent such fiascos from happening in the future. He must eliminate the duplication among drug-fighting agencies and end the waste. That's one of the main reasons why we created the drug czar in the first place. The last thing I'd like to say about the strategy the president proposes is that we have to make a greater investment in the scientific community. The scientific community that's pursuing innovative approaches for fighting the drug crisis, just as we do for cancer and for AIDS and for Alzheimer's. They're already at work. In a lab in Delaware, scientists are working on new medicines that may block an addict's craving for drugs. And across the country in Los Alamos weapons laboratories, other scientists are exploring new state-of-the-art techniques to battle the narco-terrorist. We need more of that kind of scientific enterprise. We need to enlist America's scientific muscle in turning back the drug traffickers. You know, listening to both of us, this may seem all complicated, very complicated, but it isn't. We know what has to be done. We have to educate our children not to take drugs. Reach our children who are on drugs and get them off. We have to lock up the dealers for a long, long time. and we have to attack the source from which the drugs come. And we have to do that not a piece at a time, but all at once. And we have to do it now. And there's not any reason why we can't do that. We have the power, we have the money, and we have the knowledge. And we don't have to promise a world without worry or fear. We're not asking for that much. All we have to do together is to keep our promises and stay together. To put it in very personal terms for a moment, Joe Biden, me, I would settle for a world in which I could worry about the same kinds of things that my parents worried about, in which I only had to worry about the grades my children got in school rather than the drugs they're being exposed to, in which I only had to worry about the prices my wife had to pay at the supermarket instead of fearing that she might get mugged by a junkie in the parking lot as she loads her groceries into the car, in which tonight I could call my mom just to wish her pleasant dreams, not for the purpose of making sure she's safe in her own home. That's the kind of world I want. That's the kind of world you deserve. And there's no reason we can't have it. Thank you.
But let's look at the facts. Since 1986, Congress has passed over 230 new or expanded penalties for drug and criminal offenses in this United States. 230 new penalties. And these penalties range from an automatic 5 years in jail for any person caught with a rock of crack cocaine, a piece of crack cocaine as small as a quarter. I don't have a quarter with me, but if you visualize what one looks like, yeah, I do have a quarter. If you have a piece of crack cocaine no bigger than this quarter that I'm holding in my hand, 1/4 of $1, we passed a law through the leadership of Senator Thurmond and myself and others, a law that says if you're caught with that, you go to jail for 5 years. You get no probation. You get nothing other than 5 years in jail. Judge doesn't have a choice. Now, the fact of the matter is, we've gone from there all the way up to saying, under the leadership of Senator Thurmond, and I'd like to suggest that I take some small credit for it myself as well, and others, the presiding officer, that there is now a death penalty. And we passed it a couple years ago. If you are a major drug dealer involved in the trafficking of drugs and murder results in your activities, you go to death. And a number of other severe penalties. We changed the law so that if you are arrested and you are a drug dealer, under our forfeiture statutes, you can, the government can, take everything you own, everything from your car to your house, your bank account, not merely what they confiscate in terms of the dollars from the transaction that you just got caught engaging in. They can take everything. We have laws in the last several years where we don't allow judges discretion to sentence people. Flat time sentencing. You get caught, you go to jail.
Because the decision will affect what happens in this country long after Senator Biden is gone, long after President Bush is gone, long after President Reagan's administrations are forgotten. If they live, if Justice Souter, God willing, lives, as long as the average age of the court now, he'll be making landmark decisions in the year 2020. I'll be dead and gone in all probability.
If you can, in his words, not yours, in his words, can you tell us what on that occasion he said to you? You have described the essence of the conversation. In order for us to determine, well, Can you tell us, in his words, what he said?
I really cannot quote him verbatim. I can remember something like, you really ought to see these films that I've seen, or this material that I've seen. This woman has this kind of breast, or a breast that measure this size, and they've got her in there with all kinds of things. She's doing all kinds of different sex acts, and you know, that kind of, those were the kinds of words where he expressed his enjoyment of it and seemed to try to encourage me to enjoy that kind of material as well.
Did he indicate why he thought you should see this material?
No.
Why do you think? What was your reaction? Why did you think he was saying these things to you?
Well, coupled with the pressure about going out with him, I felt that implicit in this discussion about sex was the offer to have sex with him, not just to go out with him. There was never any explicit thing about going out to dinner or going to a particular concert or movie. It was, we ought to go out. And given his other conversations, I took that to mean we ought to have sex, or we ought to look at these pornographic movies together.
Professor, at your press conference, one of your press conferences, you said that the issues that you raised about Judge Thomas, you referred to as an ugly issue. Is that how you view these conversations?
Yes, they were very ugly. They were very dirty. They were disgusting.
Were any one of these conversations, this will be my last question, my time is up, were any one of these conversations, other than being asked to go out, were any one of them repeated more than once? The same conversation, reference to?
The reference to his own physical attributes was repeated more than once, yes.
Now again, for the record, did he just say, I have great physical capability and attributes, or was he more graphic?
He was much more graphic.
Can you tell us what he said?
Well, I can tell you that he compared his penis size. He measured his penis in terms of length, those kinds of comments.
Thank you. My time is up under our agreement.
Let me tell you what is in the bill, and I'll let you all decide whether or not this is weak. Let me get down here a compendium of the things that are in the bill. One, the death penalty. It provides 53 death penalty offenses. Weak as can be, you know? We do everything but hang people for jaywalking in this bill. That's weak stuff.
The senator made a very moving and eloquent speech as a son of the Confederacy, acknowledging that it was time to change and yield to a position that Senator Carol Moseley Braun raised on the floor of the Senate, not granting a federal charter to a organization made up of many fine people who continue to display the Confederate flag.
One step is you must take back the streets. And you take back the streets by more cops, more prisons, more physical protection for the people. I hope this crime bill, when it passes, the Biden-Hatch crime bill, as it becomes law, God willing, I hope that we will have ended once and for all this notion that is a hangover from the 60s, that somehow Democrats are weak on crime and Democratic presidents are weak on crime and Republicans are tough on crime. The truth is, every major crime bill since 1976 that's come out of this Congress, every minor crime bill has had the name of the Democratic senator from the state of Delaware, Joe Biden, on that bill. We must take back the streets. It doesn't matter whether or not the person that is accosting your son or daughter or my son or daughter, my wife, your husband, my mother, your parents. It doesn't matter whether or not they were deprived as a youth. It doesn't matter or not whether or not they had no background that enabled them to become socialized into the fabric of society. It doesn't matter whether or not they're the victims of society. The end result is they're about to knock my mother on the head with a lead pipe, shoot my sister, beat up my wife, take on my sons. So I don't want to ask what made them do this. They must be taken off the street. That's number one. And that is, unless we do something about that cadre of young people, tens of thousands of them, born out of wedlock, without parents, without supervision, without any structure, without any conscience developing, because they literally, I yield myself 3 more minutes, because they literally have not been socialized. They literally have not had an opportunity. We should focus on them now, not out of a liberal instinct for love, brother, and humanity, although I think that's a good instinct, but for simple, pragmatic reasons. If we don't, they will, or a portion of them will, become the predators 15 years from now. And, Madam President, we have predators on our streets. You're looking at the fellow who was one of the primary architects of the Sentencing Commission. You know what the basic premise of the Sentencing Commission is? I know the presiding officer knows. It was the first time in 80 years we rejected the notion that the condition of sentencing must be related to how long it would take to rehabilitate. I'm the guy that said rehabilitation, when it occurs, we don't understand it and notice it, and even when we notice it and we know it occurs, we don't know why. So you cannot make rehabilitation a condition for release. That's why in our system, there's the federal system, you serve 85% of your time. I remember when it was going on, when I was making these arguments in the late 70s, they used to call it Biden's same time for the same crime provision. Despite all I've heard, I quite frankly think that both the arguments for and against NAFTA are vastly, vastly, vastly overblown. As I look at this issue, and I do not pretend to be an expert on international trade matters, I see it in the end that 3, 5, 7, 10 years from now, we're going to look down at this issue, and in terms of the context in which it's being debated about creating jobs or losing jobs, this is essentially going to be a wash. Just like when I first got in politics, even though I come from this background and ran on a law and order platform, I remember the liberals used to say, Biden is, quote, an iconoclast. That was what my newspaper called me, an iconoclast. Because how can he really be a progressive and want to lock these people up? I'm sure my friend from California gets hit with that all. How can you be a progressive and be so tough on crime? Well, I wasn't wedded to the notion. Every time Richard Nixon, when I was running in 1972, would say law and order, the Democratic mantra, the response was law and order with justice, whatever that meant. And I'd say lock the SOBs up. Well, just as it is no longer legitimate to say the Republican Party is against, as a matter of course, Social Security, the Republicans are finding out it's no longer legitimate to say the Democrats are soft on crime. Because guess what? What has every major crime bill that's gotten this far been? A Democratic crime bill.
One fundamental weakness of the War Powers Resolution is that it fails to acknowledge powers that most scholars agree are inherent presidential powers, such as the power to repel an armed attack upon the United States or its armed forces, or to rescue Americans abroad. My legislation corrects this deficiency and thus avoids the endless dispute over where the exact location of the line between what the President already possesses independently and what the Congress is bestowing on him by legislation, where that line rests. My bill enumerates 5 instances where the President may use force. First, to repel without congressional authority at the outset. First, to repel attack on U.S. territory or U.S. forces. Second, to deal with urgent situations threatening supreme U.S. interest, i.e. the Cuban Missile Crisis. 3, to extricate imperiled U.S. citizens. 4, to forestall or retaliate against specific acts of terrorism. 5, to defend against substantial threats to international sea lanes or airspace. It may be that no such enumeration can be exhaustive, but it is worth noting that the circumstances set forth would have sanctioned virtually every use of force by a president since World War II.
Mean it. I introduced the balanced budget amendment in 1984. It got nowhere. I'm one of those Democrats who voted for the constitutional amendment to balance the budget. I have introduced on 4 occasions, entire plans to balance the budget, knowing I'm not president and I'm not the leader, but for illustrative purposes. I tried with Senator Grassley back in the 80s to freeze all government spending, including Social Security, including everything.
Here's my question, and this is to you, Congressman, is in terms of where you think, if you have to pick a horse here, do you suggest that we, the United States, use all our influence and whatever force we're willing to use to deal with and promote and support the Democratic League of Kosovo or the Kosovo Liberation Army? Because right now, they ain't in tandem.
Why don't we make the question a lot more simple? Why don't we look at international law, look at a population of 2 million people that is being brutalized every day?
Because it's useful to look at reality.
Well, but reality is also, Senator, that you raised the issue of, well, who is this George Washington that we want to find in Belgrade so we can solve the problem? We may have to wait a long time. But in the meantime,
I agree.
We cannot let these people be brutalized and killed every day. I think there are things we have to do right now.
And
we have to face Slobodan Milosevic in the eye, as we did in Bosnia, and say, get every one of those VJ troops out of Kosovo. And if you don't do it, we're going to take some action. Now,
what action? We're going to bomb,
action?
right?
What are we doing?
Physical force.
Yeah, but wait a minute.
I'm not suggesting we shouldn't. I want to know what action
you just said before, the arguments you made before, the same arguments that I heard I was on a panel with Bob Torricelli and Senator McCain back in 1992 or 3 or 4 in the McLaughlin show, and they were saying the same thing. But we did something, didn't we? We waited 3 years. Sooner or later, we got the resolve, motif, and we said something has to be done.
No.
Why is this any different?
Well, no, it is different because, no, it's not different. I just want to know what you suggest, because back then, when I was in your position, I was suggesting we bomb Belgrade. I was suggesting that we send American pilots in and blow up all the bridges on the Drina. I was suggesting we take out his oil supplies. I was suggesting very specific action.
And isn't it interesting that we didn't have to go that far to begin the solution in Bosnia?
Isn't it interesting that about 200,000 people were killed in the meantime by the time they did it?
Yes. And that's going to happen in Kosovo.
That's why I want to know what you're suggesting now.
What we have to do right now is to enforce international law. We have war criminals in Belgrade. We're dealing with one right now. I said that article before. I have a copy of it right here. Here it is. It was in the Gannett papers on Sunday. There's Slobodan Milosevic, side by side Mr. Karadzic, who's now got a book coming out pointing the finger at him for all these atrocities in Bosnia. Why aren't we picking him up?
Because the French, in the French quarter, and the French let him walk around. That's why.
It seems to me that we've got a double standard here. If we're going to be the great United States of America, standing up for oppressed people, and I believe we can do that without sending military all over the world. Let's pick up the war criminals in Belgrade. We know who they are. We know where they are. And number two, let's tell Mr. Milosevic, get every troop out of there. You know why? It's not because we want him to, because we like it. He is now on the brink of creating a Balkan war. You know the problems we have between Greece and Turkey. You know how fragile Macedonia is. You know that we right now have 600 troops on the border in Macedonia. What are we waiting for? If he keeps doing this, all he's doing is raising the temperature, and as the Greek foreign minister said, the hand grenade will explode and the Balkans will explode. Well, we have no choice. Let's do something now than have to do 20 times more later on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me begin by saying I think, Major, have provided, and are providing a very, very, very valuable service to your country by coming forward as you have. Because, quite frankly, I think what you've done is you've forced us to come to our milk here, all of us in the United States Congress. I think you and I believe, and many of us believe here, as long as Saddam's at the helm, there is no reasonable prospect you or any other inspector is ever going to be able to guarantee that we have rooted out, root and branch, the entirety of Saddam's program relative to weapons of mass destruction. And you and I both know, and all of us here really know, and it's the thing we have to face, that the only way we're going to get rid of Saddam Hussein is we're going to end up having to start it alone, and it's going to require guys like you in uniform to be back on foot in the desert taking taking Saddam down. You know it and I know it. So I think we should not kid ourselves here. There's stark choices. I happen to agree with your assessment. A, that diplomacy was picked over inspection-driven confrontation. B, that there's an illusion of arms control that cannot guarantee he will have no system of no weapons of mass destruction. And C, that as long as he's there, he's concluded he can absorb airstrikes. So I think you've done a significant service for this country. A different policy judgment has been made. If we don't like the policy judgment, in my view, from observation has been made by the administration and the Security Council and our allies. If we don't like it, we should step up to the ball and say it. Because you forced us, and I think properly so, to a day of reckoning here about what our policy should be. I look forward to hearing what you have to say. And welcome, even without the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense. Even if the president should be impeached, history is going to question whether or not this was just a partisan lynching or whether or not it was something that, in fact, met the standard, the very high bar that was set by the founders as to what constituted an impeachable offense.
Senator Biden, is the president getting a little squishy on this?
Look, you have probably the only three people in Washington here who think we should go straight to Belgrade and arrest Milosevic. But let's not kid each other. We're the only three people. The rest of this is malarkey. The Republican Congress won't even vote for the bombing. The NATO forces won't even go along with the idea of ground troops. And whether or not the president will or will not is not relevant. The question, it seems to me, is what is the definition of victory? We sat in this program before. The definition of victory was all the troops out of Kosovo, the Albanians back in Kosovo, and a NATO-led force in Kosovo. That's not total victory. That's not the victory I want. That's not the victory John wants. I've been saying we should go on the ground. We should announce there's going to be American casualties. We should go to Belgrade, and we should have a Japanese, German-style occupation of that country, and we should have public trials. in order to strike away this mask of this Serbian victimization so the people of Serbia know what's happened. It's the only thing that will ultimately work, but that's not what anyone but the three of us have been talking about from the beginning. So when the president says he's not for total victory, he's not for what we're for. But he never was, nor was NATO, nor was anybody but the three of us.
Senator Biden, are you concerned that we're going to compromise out, give concessions, and be seen as, in fact, losing this war?
The answer is I am. I spoke with him for 20 minutes with Bill Cohen last night because I wanted to ask some questions of the Secretary of Defense. One, is this going to be a NATO-led force? He said under no conditions will there be anything but a NATO-led force. Two, are all the troops going to have to be out of Yugoslavia? I mean, out of Kosovo? And he said, yes, they will. And I said, what's this about a bombing pause? He said, the only thing we're talking about there is if, in fact, there is overwhelming evidence that the troops are on their way out, we will not bomb them on their way out. Now, that's what he told me last night. The idea of things going bad with the Russians, actually things are going better for the Russians, which worries both of us a little bit. They're going better for the Russians. Two, they were already bad with the Chinese. And three, the reason why it's so important that we're in there is quite bluntly, and I get in trouble for saying this, but the Europeans have never led anything. We are a European power. If we are not pushing this, the whole thing will collapse. And that's where I do have some sympathy for John's criticism of the administration. I think it's a little excessive, but John's criticism of the administration, which is that they're not doing enough. We are the driver. We're the driver. We're European power. If we don't do it, no one else in Europe will.
But just keep bombing and bombing and bombing until Milosevic gives in.
I'm like the other two here, that we should have not taken the option of ground troops off the table.
But it is off the table.
It's off forever now.
The bombing's working, Tim. Look, here's where we disagree. The only reason Milosevic is even talking about talking is because he's being hurt badly. We've had 5 clear days. 5 clear days, that's all in the bombing. And now we're going to be moving on 360 degrees, 24 hours a day. I would use ground troops. The NATO will not use ground troops, but the bombing is inflicting.
Is the bombing working?
No, and I think Mr. Milosevic is willing to talk once he's achieved most of his goals, which he has.
What will you say?
Well, I'll say it as loudly as I can. It's a big, big disaster for the United States and for NATO.
But that's not going to happen. We can't let that happen.
They are desperately seeking a diplomatic solution, and they're not dealing from a position of strength. That's why I'm very concerned.
Off to the Hague. That's right.
Well, I agree with that, but remember, that was never part of the deal that everybody signed on, except the three of us. So let's be fair about it.
All right, we'll be back with a lot more of the Three Amigos. We have to take a quick break. A lot more coming up after this. Joe Abdul, John McCain, Joe Biden, thank you.
I know of no other drug that I've been exposed to studying that has such a profile in the circumstance under which it's consumed as this drug. You might know that Richie Daley, who I think is one of the best mayors in America, and he is focused on drug problem, I think this is more of a local problem. If I were governor of my state or mayor of my town, I would be passing new ordinances relating to stiff criminal penalties for anyone who held a rave. The promoter, the guy who owned the building. I would put the son of a gun in jail. I would change the law. But we're afraid to do that because we affect commercial interests. They get kind of shaky when we do that. I would be moving vigorously. It's no, you can ask, my cops are going to come and testify. And you know your folks. There's no doubt about where these raves are. In the middle of the desert. Arrest the promoter. Find a rationale unrelated to drugs. Keeping an unsafe, for example, I'm the guy who authored the crack house legislation. We can use the crack house legislation to tear down these buildings. So I think we better send a message out to the local officials here, to the mayors, the governors, and everybody else, that if you were able to, theoretically, eliminate the circumstances and the places under which raves took place, and or, in addition to which, policed those which on their face are legitimate, you would cut into this in an incredible way, more than if we gave you 500 more DEA agents. Literally, not figuratively, literally. You can't seal the border, man. And Mr. Winwood, you can't seal the border. There's no one been more supportive of you getting more help and money. I remember when the governor called, when he was governor of Florida, the man sitting to my left.
and found out that they chased these boats that were coming into Florida, and the Coast Guard and Customs had no boats fast enough or enough fuel to chase the folks who were coming in cigarette boats in broad daylight. I mean, and dropping them off. Dropping off the drugs and then taking off. We couldn't catch them. But that's not the answer. We have to learn to walk and chew gum at the same time. We shouldn't stop that. But I hope we start to focus on this notion of local police changing the circumstances and using the existing federal legislation to go after this. Because unlike heroin, unlike cocaine, unlike powdered or crack cocaine, unlike crank, unlike ice, unlike any of these things, the place where the first time most young people are exposed to these drugs, if the numbers are correct, and I may be wrong about this, if I'm wrong about this, it doesn't matter, and I'm wrong overall, is in settings where there are a large number of other young people. And I think we should be giving incentives to mayors and cities and counties and local law enforcement officers to increase their penalties in return for additional assistance, additional help, while we continue to increase assistance to you to interdict. But there ain't enough customs agents to collect enough pills coming from now the Netherlands, but mark my words, it will be a major industry. Anybody, look, all these guys are looking for new product. You remember, Donnie, we had a little debate, not you and I, but DEA and I predicted that heroin would be a major source of the economy, of the new economy of the drug lords in Colombia. I said, no, that's Southeast Asia, man, they're not going to do that. They're not going to get in that business. They need new product, just like stockbrokers need new products, like grocery stores need new products. This is a new product. And anything you can make that is going to cost you pennies on a dollar to make, and you can sell for up to $40 a pill, it doesn't take long for the serious boys to get involved in this. So I'd like you to comment on this notion of putting more responsibility on zoning, on local law enforcement, on criminal penalties for endangering lives. You don't have to get them for drugs. Turn off the water, I put you in jail. I put you in jail. That's the scum who should be put in jail, not just the guy selling the pills. The guy opens up the warehouse, turns off the water, and sells it for $5 or $10 a bottle because it's required. What do we do about that? Does it make sense?
At any rate, Linda Douglas is in Washington with us tonight, and she is with Joe Biden, the Democratic chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, who will undoubtedly have something to say. Yes, Linda.
Thank you very much, Peter. It's been very difficult to get to you today because all the communications around the Capitol have really been shut down. As you know, earlier today, the entire Capitol was evacuated, the members of Congress, the staffs. There were some very frightening moments where they were shouting at us to get down. They thought something was going to happen. The leaders of the Senate were taken away early this morning to an undisclosed location by security, and security has also told other leaders of Congress to leave the area. The minority leader of the House, Richard Gephardt, was taken away in a Secret Service vehicle. And as you say, with me here is Senator Biden, who is the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee and has just been meeting with other members of Congress and getting security briefings from the police mostly. But Senator Biden, what about this fear that has been communicated to the members of Congress by the security people that they should stay away right now from the center of the Capitol?
Well, I think maybe initially that made sense, Linda, but I don't think it makes sense now. The air is secure now with military planes. I think we should get back as quick as we can, Peter, into session. Now, I don't want to second-guess the security people. They want to be able to sweep the area, make sure everything's squared away. But I think we should be meeting tomorrow morning. Let the American people understand that these thugs who have done this incredible thing to the United States have not, in any fundamental way, altered our ability to do business. And so I think it's very important we get back to business. I've communicated that to the Majority Leader, Tom Daschle, who I think shares my view on that. And when I spoke to Senator Daschle, by the way, he was home, he was here in town. There's a number of members of Congress, Congressman Brady from Philadelphia and a number of my colleagues are literally downstairs waiting for me now.
So I think we have to show that we're up, we're ready to move. We are, in fact, nothing has fundamentally altered this government, and the tragedy that occurred to these thousands of people is one that we must, in fact, follow through and find out who's responsible for. But in the meantime, we should be calm and cool and collected about going about our business as a nation. Terrorism wins when, in fact, they alter our civil liberties or shut down our institutions. We have to demonstrate neither of those things have happened.
Senator Biden, a couple of the senators I've spoken to and members of Congress as well are saying that we are now at war. Senator Shelby, who is the ranking Republican on the Intelligence Committee, says we are now essentially at war. We have to be on a war footing. Senator Hagel has said that we've got to start securing our borders, locking down our airports, revisiting the way we protect our public institutions. What about that?
I hope that's not true. I would say it another way. I would say we've come face to face with a new reality. A reality that we knew existed and we knew was possible. A reality that has happened in varying degrees in other countries. But if, in fact, in order to respond to that reality, we have to alter our civil liberties, change the way we function, then we have truly lost the war. The war is one that allows us the way to conduct the war is to demonstrate our institutions are functioning, that your civil liberties, your civil rights, your ability to be free and walk and move around, in fact, are not fundamentally altered. Anybody who's willing to strap dynamite to their body or have a suicide kamikaze mission, you'll never fundamentally be able to stop. It doesn't matter what you do. There are a lot of things we can do, though, to diminish significantly the possibility of this happening again without changing our character as a nation.
Well, it's an amazing scene here, Peter. The skies are clear. There are usually planes in the sky. The skies are clear over the Capitol. The streets are completely empty. There is still smoke rising up from the Pentagon where the plane hit the Pentagon earlier. And as you can see, the members of Congress are all trying to grapple with what to do next. Senator Biden, of course, is going to be receiving all kinds of security briefings.
Linda, I have a question, if I may.
Yes, Peter, go ahead.
I have a question for the Senator. I apologize via you. The Senator is the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, so he is party to all of the information in the intelligence community. Was the intelligence community so taken up with the idea of chemical and biological warfare against the United States that they didn't pay enough attention to this possibility?
Well, they clearly understood this was a possibility. The problem has been we have been focusing, in my view, I don't want to second guess anybody here. Look, the prospect of a chemical, biological, pathogen probability is real. Some of us, literally as recently as yesterday, I spoke to the National Press Club and talked about the fact that it's just as easy to fly from National Airport into the White House as it is to, do the same thing in New York. I mean, look, we know all these possibilities exist. And one of the things we have to do is we have to get our priorities straight in terms of what the real threats are that face us and use the assets we have to begin to deal with those threats. What I don't want everybody to think is this is some worldwide conspiracy where there's tens of thousands of people who are part of this army that attacked us. This is a group of people who are very well organized, obviously are relatively well funded, and we have to figure out how their network has worked, but we have to penetrate it. But we can't, Peter, just say we're going to focus only on this kind of incident and not on chemical and not on biological and not on pathogens, not on anthrax. This, in a sense, is the most god-awful wake-up call we've ever had to how we have to redirect our resources.
Let me ask you one more question, then. I didn't realize you could hear me. At the Pentagon and the State Department, you already hear people doing what they almost always do in an instance like this. This is so sophisticated it must be Osama bin Laden. Maybe so, but is the United States too focused on one man?
The tendency in these circumstances is to be too focused on one man, one idea, one prospect. I think that we should be calm. Those of us who hold high public office, just calm down a little bit, collect our thoughts, collect the information, and in a methodical way analyze what we know happened and what we can derive from that. I think it's much too early for us to make those kinds of judgments. The first thing is what the president is doing. He called for calm, he's getting in the airplane, he's coming back to Washington, D.C., and I applaud him for that. And we should be back up and running as quickly as we can. And I think we should do that. This cannot be dealt with overnight. It's an incredible tragedy. But it's the new threat of the 21st century that we are now facing. And we're going to find a way to deal with it. This nation is too big, too strong, too united, too too much a power in terms of our cohesion and our values to let this break us apart, and it won't happen. It won't happen.
Joining me now is Democratic Senator Joe Biden, who is the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Senator, same question for you that I began with Senator McCain. What is your assessment of how the administration is organizing its efforts in the first 48 hours?
I just spoke with Secretary Powell. I think they're doing an incredible job in getting a consensus here. Tom, for the first time in the history of NATO passed a resolution, the so-called NAC, the group that makes these decisions, as you know, passed a resolution saying this is an Article 5 action, meaning that an attack against one is an attack against all. Translated, if we can show, which we will be able to, that this was an asset from outside of the United States that did this, that they will join us in pursuing the aggressor. This is a big deal. Secondly, we have had significant input from moderate Arab states who I believe, and I think the Secretary will be able to put together, will be supportive of whatever action we take. China and Russia have expressed, understand they never have before because they understand their growing vulnerability, the willingness to deal with these folks and whatever state is harboring them. This is an opportunity. People are talking about, Tom, about our way of life ending. Wrong. The way of life of organized terrorist cells is about to end. They crossed the line. They crossed the line. And the civilized world, I predict you, is going to respond, and I compliment Secretary Powell on beginning this organizational effort.
Senator Biden, I remember Desert Storm, on the eve of Operation Desert Storm in the Senate, there was a very spirited debate and a very close vote about whether the Senate would support then-President George Bush the 41st in his efforts to get Iraq out of Kuwait. Do you expect anything like that kind of divisive debate?
Absolutely not, Tom. And Tom, if I may say, you asked John a question. John's a close friend. You asked him a question about we wouldn't put troops on the ground in Kosovo. John and I were the ones that had the resolution saying put troops on the ground in Kosovo. This is not Kosovo. The American people have been attacked. There will be overwhelming support. The military understands. The people understand. I would be dumbfounded if a single person would argue against using military ground forces if that is deemed to be necessary.
And this military operation, as Senator McCain and others have indicated today, the American public has to be aware of the fact that it could go on for some time.
Yes, well, by the way, it may go on sporadically, but Tom, we have an opportunity here, if we do will, to actually unite the world in dealing with this so we can begin to end the possibility of large-scale terrorist organizations having the succor and support of other nations. I mean, everybody has to understand. For example, the Pakistanis have to understand they got to pick sides now. Everybody's got to pick a side, Tom, off the sidelines, period. And I think that's going to happen. This has never happened in the whole second half of the 20th century. This is a seminal moment. And I think every once in a while, Tom, some group, some individual, some nation goes so far that they crossed every line. The terrorist organization involved here crossed the line, and I think they've signed their death warrant and the death warrant for the ability of these kinds of cells to exist with the support of other nations.
Thank you so much, Senator Joe Biden.
Of what it's like to get that phone call. I have some small notion of that. And so I know nothing that good that comes from this, nothing, even if the best occurs and we really get our arms around the terrorist activities worldwide, will give any solace to any of the people who've lost loved ones here. But it is, my mom has an expression, out of every tragedy, something good may come if you look hard enough. This gives no solace to the people who have been injured. And right now, probably Americans are listening to me saying, Biden, why aren't you just talking about the anger you feel? Well, I feel incredible anger about what's happened, but I also feel that this is an opportunity, if we do it correctly, and I like the way Powell's going about this, that we may very well do something very, very good.
Your assistants are saying to my colleagues that you have to go, because I got to get two questions in.
Sure.
Do you believe that Osama bin Laden and his associates are responsible for these attacks? Do you, Senator Biden, Chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, believe Osama bin Laden and his colleagues, associates, are responsible?
Because I've accessed all the classified information, if I answer that either way, Charlie, it's going to be my violating. I mean, it's going to be presumed it's based on information I've been given. So I'm going to, I apologize.
Okay, well, let me ask the second question. Do you believe it's possible that someone could have carried these acts off with the precision of these 4 planes and perhaps more without having some relationship to the intelligence organizations of other states, like Iraq, like whoever you might choose?
I won't mention any country, but I think it's very unlikely, virtually impossible, for an action like this to have carried off without at least the tacit assistance of another country.
And by that you mean more than simply harboring them, but giving them information, helping train, whatever it might be.
I don't want to comment beyond that. Not now, Charlie. I apologize. I know it's frustrating, but I apologize for not commenting beyond that.
Final question. Do you expect there might be military action sooner rather than later because of the velocity of the investigation and the provable facts as to the identity of those responsible?
I think we may be in a position to move sooner than later, but I think if the coalition of the willing is pulling together as I hope it is, there may be a decision made, even if we could go earlier, to go slightly later in order to bring to bear more of not just our assets, but the world's assets against this organization.
Senator Biden, thank you. I know you had to wait because of some technical problems, and I thank you very much.
Don't apologize. I'm flattered you invited me on your show. Thank you.
Thank you for coming. Senator Joseph Biden, Chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. We'll be back in just a moment.
I will continue with every fiber in my being to keep America involved with troops that can shoot and kill to protect the rights of the Albanians wherever they reside in the Balkans. That we have finished our job in the region. Let me define for you what I mean by finishing our job. We should stay till the job is finished. Let me define what that is. The definition of the job being finished is that there be a genuine growth of democratic institutions and the region, including Kosovo and Macedonia and Albania, a free and fair elected Albania, that they are on the road. They're on the road to NATO membership, and they're on the road to becoming part of the European Union, because until that moment arrives, there will be no real security for Albanians living in the Balkans. Number one, the world should and must recognize the suffering, the pain, the loss, and the travail that the Albanian people in the region have gone through. And there's a reason for that. It's not merely my desire to see exposed those who perpetrated what I consider to be war crimes. It is my view, historically, that until the Serbian people look themselves in the face, understand what their leaders have done and convince them of. Until that moment arrives, the Serbian people will not be able to shed this notion of victimization that all of their leaders prey upon and manipulate them with. The value of the Nuremberg trials was not to punish. It was to expose and make the German people look themselves in the eye and not allow them to go through the self-rationalization, as they did in World War II, that they had been victimized. That is a necessary precondition. Why, some of you ask, have I been so relentless on Serbia and Kostunica, who I do not trust? Why have I been so persistent in not providing aid for the people of Serbia, who are many good people? Why? Because until they look in their hearts, they can never cure themselves of the disease that they are the oppressed. And as long as they operate on that standard, this cycle will continue and continue and continue. So that's why, not for vengeance, but for release, that it's necessary for them to look the devil in the eye. For I believe they are equally as noble, equally as bright, equally as capable as a people as any people in Europe. But they have been fighting the Battle of Pristina since 1388. It's time the blackbirds be put to rest. It's time they look in their souls. The second point I wish to make to you is the reason why I believe it is absolutely essential for American troops to be on the ground with loaded rifles and drawn bayonets is that, notwithstanding the good intentions of all the parties, my mother would say the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Notwithstanding good intentions, the normal, serious human emotions can prevent what everybody knows in their heart has to happen. For unless the region can live within boundaries that are multi-ethnic, you will never, never, never see God in a political sense. You will never see the light. You will remain in the backwaters of modern history, no matter how noble your heritage. And sometimes you need someone standing there to remind you, to overcome your lesser instincts for your more noble instincts. When I say you, I mean you in an editorial sense. I mean all people of every culture. The third point I want to make to you is that we have an obligation as Americans to not only stay, but to remain invested for our own safety's sake. For the United States cannot remain secure in the world without a secure and stable Europe. And Europe cannot be stable without finally having Southeast Europe become a stable part of that world. So it's in our own naked self-interest beyond the pure dictates of human decency to stay involved. And that means involved financially as well as militarily until the moment comes. And by the way, you all are going to end up being divided. Remember I said this. You'll be divided among yourselves. You will begin to reflect the necessary divisions that will take place in Kosovo among Albanians. I don't mean fighting. I mean political disagreement. You will be split, and you will argue over dinner and at the restaurant and on the way to the ball game between yourselves about what is the role that should be played in Montenegro, Macedonia, whatever. And I don't want you to despair with that. It is maybe the single most healthy thing that can happen, because that is the cacophony of the voices of democracy. That is the first normal, painful step. I came over and sat. I don't know whether I be in his party or not. I don't know enough to know. But I want to tell you, I respect this man. And I came over and I reminded him of my conversation. I said, what you should get about doing, you remember in that room? I said, you should get about building a political party. Many people are great warriors, but very few warriors become great politicians. It's a difficult transition. This man's on the way of doing that. And I leaned over and I grabbed him and I joked with him and I said, welcome to democracy.
That if military action is necessary, the United States and our allies will help the Iraqi people rebuild their economy and create the institutions of liberty in a unified Iraq at peace with its neighbors. End of quote. Let me repeat that again. This is what the President said. The United States and our allies will help the Iraqi people rebuild their economy and create the institutions of liberty in a unified Iraq at peace with its neighbors. End of quote. Mr. President, this is a much more complicated country than Afghanistan. Mr. President, we have not done it in Afghanistan. Mr. President, we have not even kept our commitment in Afghanistan yet. So, Mr. President, we are taking on a big deal here. We may need to do it. I know the President, presiding officer, and my colleague from Ohio and my colleague from Vermont on the floor here know that Iraq is an artificially constructed nation. When has there been a circumstance in Iraq when there's been anything remotely approaching a democratic republic? I cannot think of it in the history of the Iraq as defined now. The Kurds are Indo-European Sunnis. The Sunnis are Arab Sunnis. The Shias that make up 60% of the population, primarily living between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, they are Shias who have been at war with the Sunnis. The Iranians are Shia. There are 600,000 Iraqi Shia in Iran. Mr. President, this is complicated stuff. But to listen to some of my colleagues on the floor who blithely blow this off like, no problem, take down Saddam, there's a James Madison waiting to step into the vacuum, we'll have a democratic republic, it will set a new tone and tenor for all, as the Vice President said, for all of the Middle East, because we'll have a new democracy there. Mr. President, that is a big deal. I'll vote for this because we should support compelling Iraq to make good on its obligations to the United Nations. I'm among those who had serious reservations about and flat out straight opposition to the first draft proposed by the White House on September 19th. The draft raised more questions than it answered. It was not clear whether the authorization requested by the President to use force was limited to Iraq or applicable to the region as a whole. It was not clear whether the objective was to compel Iraq to destroy its weapons of mass destruction programs, to liberate Kuwaiti prisoners, or to end Saddam Hussein's regime. It was not clear whether the rationale for action was to enforce the UN Security Council resolutions that Saddam has flouted for the last decade, or to implement a new doctrine of preemption. And it was not clear whether the administration considered working through the UN and working with allies important or irrelevant. Saddam is dangerous. The world would be a better place without him. But the reason he poses a growing danger to the United States and its allies is that he possesses chemical and biological weapons
and is seeking with his $2 billion a year illegally skimmed from the UN Fund for Food, his Oil for Food program, for Peace program, that he is seeking nuclear weapons. And for years now, he has prevented the United Nations inspectors from uncovering those weapons and verifying Iraq's disarmament. And he is in violation of the terms he agreed to, allowing him to stay in power. The second draft, negotiated with congressional leadership, and I would say, I believe in part as a consequence of the efforts of my good friend Senator Lugar and I, and roughly 23 or 24 Republicans, got the attention of the administration. They were simultaneously negotiating with the senator from Indiana and me, as well as the leader in the House. The leader in the House reached an agreement first. I thought that was unfortunate because I believe we could have had a better resolution had that not occurred. But nonetheless, the second draft negotiated addressed some of these questions but left others unanswered. Along with many of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, notably Senator Lugar, I continue to seek greater clarity about the focus of the proposed resolution. President Bush brought the resolution into sharper focus this week in his speech to the nation. He said that, quote, war is neither imminent nor inevitable. He also said that his objective was to disarm Iraq, that his rationale to enforce the United Nations resolution was not based upon preemption, and that he desired to lead the world, and if war was necessary, it would be with allies at our side. Mr. President, the resolution now before the Congress similarly is clearer and more focused than previous drafts. It is not perfect, but it acknowledges the core concerns that Senator Lugar and I and others raised, and which have been raised by such senators as Hagel and Specter and many others. Considered in the context of the President's speech this week and his address last month to the United Nations General Assembly, this resolution, though still imperfect, deserves our support, and let me explain why. First, the objective is more clearly and carefully stated. The objective is to compel Iraq to destroy its illegal weapons of mass destruction and its programs to develop and produce missiles and more of those weapons.
Back from Iraq, both on the Foreign Relations Committee. Ranking Democrat Joe Biden of Delaware and Nebraska Republican Chuck Hagel, both joining us from Capitol Hill tonight. Gentlemen, welcome and thanks for being with us. Senator Biden, let me start with you first. You said that U.S. forces may need to be in Iraq for up to 5 years. Do you think the American people really understand what that means?
No, I don't, and I don't think they've been told. We held hearings as far back as last July, and it was clear from the experts then that we're going to have, at that time they said 75,000 forces up to 3 years. I think there'll be some U.S. presence for a long time.
Senator Hagel, is there really an exit strategy here?
Well, the exit strategy is when Iraq is able to govern itself. Now, how long that's going to take, as Senator Biden said, we're not sure. But the fact is, we're in. And we have the responsibility now to make all this work. It's an awesome responsibility. It's an awesome task. But we need to quickly get our international friends into this to help us. We need more UN participation. We need more troops from other nations in, because it's going to be difficult for America to sustain the troop level and the commitment in order to get this done. But we are now in, and we have a big responsibility ahead of us.
Well, I mean, you can understand the question because of the past. I mean, essentially, the United States here, about 3 months after the fall of Baghdad, is talking about being in Iraq for 5 years. I mean, should American people be concerned that it could be more than 5 years that the U.S. is tangled up in Iraq?
I think we just take it a year at a time here. The first thing is for the president to tell the American people what he knows. We've spoken to him about it, others have, that we have a major commitment that's going to take a long time, whether it's 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, whether it's 2 years. It's a lot longer than what people expect. We've been saying, both of us, along with the now chairman of the committee, Senator Lugar and others, that, hey, look, this is not the day after we talked about the decade after. This is a long-term process. I just came from a hearing in the Foreign Relations Committee where we're talking about our position in the Balkans. We still have troops in Bosnia and in Kosovo.
Yeah, so Senator Hagel, what's it going to cost?
Well, we're trying to get some numbers from the administration, but when Senator Biden, Senator Lugar, and I spent about 14 hours in Iraq 48 hours ago, we came back with a little better understanding of the sense of the magnitude, which means cost. Now, we need to know, as Joe said, the people of this country need to know some sense of cost, some sense of commitment. This is a heavy-duty cost. The fact is that the oil produced in Iraq is not going to cover a lot of this, and we need to make sure that American people understand that there is going to be a drain on our treasury for this.
Senator Biden, let me ask you about the human cost that we're talking about here. American and British soldiers still being killed yesterday, a very deadly day. The ambushes continue. When you talk about years, this going on for years, I mean, what about the possibility of the Iraqi resistance growing?
That doesn't have to go on for years. If we do this thing right, if we bring in NATO, if we include the international community, if we are able to make this transition, which I feel a little better about politically, to the Iraqis, we'll be there helping them. We'll not be there getting shot. But if we continue to decide, as apparently some of the Defense Department and civilian side have said, that we don't really need the help of the Europeans, we don't need the help of NATO, we're going to do this ourselves, we're not going to involve the UN more, then I think we end up paying the price both in blood and also in treasure. And by the way, this is worth the effort. I mean, don't misunderstand me, at least, and I don't think the senator either, and that is, we're not complaining that now we know this. We knew this in the beginning.
Well, you say it's worth the effort. Let me ask you both. I mean, at what cost? Human cost, the actual dollar expense, and for how long?
As long as it takes to make sure that Iraq does not devolve into a civil war, that the Iranians do not control the southern part of Iraq.
There must be a limit, though.
Well, no, it's in our interest. That's where the terror comes from. That's where if we get this wrong, after going in and waging a war, if we don't finish the job, there will be more chaos and we will be more susceptible than we were before, in my view.
John, this is an imperfect process. We're into something we've never been into before. We don't understand many of the dynamics. But the fact is, just as Senator Biden said, this is in the short-term and long-term interest of this country, United States of America. Our security interests, the stability of the world, the Middle East peace plan is involved in this. Afghanistan's future is involved, the entire Middle East. It's the center of gravity for the world right now in this era of time. And it must be done right, just as Senator Biden said. So it is in the interest of this country, and I believe America, if they are told and given the facts why it is in the interest of our country, I think they'll support it and sustain it. But we can't give a year or 2-year deadline. We don't know. But that's why it's so important that we get our international partnerships involved right now.
Senator Biden and Senator Hagel, it's good to see both of you. And again, thanks for taking the time to talk with us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Ranking member, Senator Biden.
I want to try to ask a couple very specific questions, and if you help me by giving as quick an answer as you could. Mr. Bolton, what are your working assumptions on the cost side for the rest of 03 and for 04 for Iraq?
For the rest of 03, Senator Biden, on the cost side, our working assumptions are those that Ambassador Bremer has brought back to us. He's anticipating expenditures in the range for the total of 03 of about $7.3 billion.
How much will you be requesting for the remainder of the year, if any, from the United States Congress to fund that need?
We don't anticipate requesting anything additional for the balance of this year.
And what do you anticipate for 04?
I don't know the answer to that. Ambassador Bremer has laid out a reasonably specific budget for the balance of 03, and I think he had an opportunity to discuss that with you. But even that was relatively crude because of they're just getting a handle on so many of the variables that are in play right now.
You anticipate we'll be continuing to spend $4 billion a month for our troops in Iraq for 04?
That's roughly what we're spending now. Looking out over the immediate term, we don't have any reason to expect a dramatic change in that number. But I wouldn't want to predict beyond the next couple of months because the situation is so variable.
Don't you have to? I mean, we're talking about the 04 budget. We're going to be voting on that in the next couple months. What the devil are you going to ask us for?
Well, in the 04 budget, and Senator, as you know, we've been very explicit about it. We have not included the incremental costs of our fighting forces in Iraq, nor the costs of reconstruction. So
why?
Simply because we don't know what they will be.
Oh, come on now. Does anybody here at the table think we're going to be down below 100,000 forces in the next calendar year? Raise your hand, any one of you. You know it's going to be more than that. So you know at least it's going to be $2.5 billion a month. Give me a break, will you? When are you guys starting to be honest with us? Come on. I mean, this
Senator,
is ridiculous.
To suggest that this is an issue of honesty really is very...
It is a suggestion of candor. Of candor. You know there's going to be at least 100,000 American forces there for the next calendar year.
Senator,
and you're not asking us for any money. Let me finish, please. Let me finish.
Okay.
And you are not asking us for any money in next year's budget for those troops. Now, what do you call that?
Senator, there will be a supplemental request. There is no question about that. And there will be a supplemental request when we think we can make a reasonably good estimate of what will get us through the whole year. So that we won't have to keep coming up here with one supplemental request after another. So I don't sit here and say, well, maybe the number is going to be 100,000, and then it turns out it's 120,000, and then people accuse us of being misleading or dishonest.
Well, I think
we know what the number is now. We know what we're trying to do in terms of enlisting other countries. We don't know whether the PACs are going to come through with a division. We don't know whether the Turks are going to come through with a division. We don't know how rapidly we're going to be able to train Iraqis.
Are you suggesting if, in fact, they come through with divisions, we're going to reduce American forces?
I believe that that's exactly the purpose of getting foreign troops in. In fact, in southern Iraq today, we are handing responsibility for key provinces of Iraq over to the Poles and the Spaniards and the Italians, and we're taking Marines out. We're not replacing them with Americans.
So we're going to have a net reduction of American forces for
I'm not predicting, Senator. I don't know. Until we get these Ba'athist criminals under control, we're going to put in whatever it takes to do the job. But we are trying to get other people to fill in for us. We're trying to get Iraqis to fill in for us. And I think by the end of the year, early next year, we'll have a much better fix on what it takes to get through the year.
Do you have any expectation that you're going to be able to stand up an Iraqi army of any consequence in the next 6 months?
Senators Joseph Biden and Lindsey Graham traveled to Baghdad this weekend. I spoke with them earlier this morning from Amman, Jordan. Good morning, Senators. There's now 10 days to go until the turnover, and I know you were on the ground in Iraq for only a short time, but from what you've seen and heard, Senator Biden, are you more optimistic now or less?
I'm slightly more optimistic for two reasons. One, George, we met with the Prime Minister, I think, is Alawi, the interim Prime Minister. He's realistic, he's smart, he has a clear sense of what has to happen, and he knows it's not a long shot, but a tough shot. And secondly, meeting with all our commanders on the ground, our military commanders, they have been chastened in a way that they realize that there's going to have to be some changes made relative to the mix of their forces, as well as how long they're going to be there. And thirdly, I think the Iraqi people are, quite frankly, less desirous of us leaving quickly than I thought they were before we came. So if we're smart, and if we view June 30th as a start date and not an end date, and we learn a little bit from the lessons of the past year, I think we can, I still think this can be salvaged.
I know you don't care what the reaction of the ink-stained wretches is generally, but watching this campaign, as we all have for so long, it seems like every 10 minutes there's a shift in sort of what the strategy is. Again,
who gives a shit whether you think or anybody thinks they're going to stick to a message? What is important is what's coming out of his mouth. The story is what's coming out of his mouth, not whether Joe Lockhart got trumped by me or anybody else to change the message. That ain't the story. That's your story, but that ain't the story anybody around here cares about.
Critic raised eyebrows with a surprise admonition at the president's critics overseas.
I've spent a little bit of time in Europe recently, and I have one simple message. Get over it. Get over it. President Bush is our president for the next 4 years. So get over it and start to act in your interest.
So let me describe it in some detail. In the summer of '37, Roosevelt had just come off a landslide victory over Alf Landon. He had a Congress made up of solid New Dealers, but the 9 old men of the court were thwarting his agenda. In this environment, Roosevelt, and remember this old adage about power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, corrupted by power, in my view, unveiled his court-packing plan. He wanted to increase the number of justices to 15, allowing himself to nominate those additional judges. It took an act of courage on the part of his own party institutionally to stand up against this power grab. In May of '37, the Senate Judiciary Committee, a committee controlled by Democrats and supportive of his political ends. I ask unanimous consent. I can see my time's about up. I'd ask unanimous consent that my entire statement be entered in the record, Mr. President. And I conclude by stating to you that the issue will be, will historians studying the actions taken in the spring of '05 look upon the current members of this body as statesmen who place the institution of the Senate above party and politics, or will historians see us as politicians bending to the will of the executives and to political exigency? I, for one, am comfortable with that role that I will play in the upcoming debate, and in my heart, I believe even if this is called, there will be at least 6 men and women of rectitude on that side of the body that will not allow the deterioration of the constitutional responsibility of this body. I yield the floor.
Without objection.
Rid of the filibuster has long-term consequences. If there's one thing I've learned in my years here, once you change the rules and surrender the Senate's institutional power, you never get it back. And we're about to break the rules to change the rules. I don't want to hear about fair play from my friends. Under our rules, you're required to get a 2/3 vote. 60 votes to change the rules. Watch what happens. Watch what happens when the majority leader stands up and says to the vice president, if we go forward with this, and he calls the question. And one of us, I expect our leader, the Democratic side, will stand up and say, parliamentary inquiry, Mr. President, is this parliamentarily appropriate? And in every other case since I've been here for 32 years, the presiding officer leans down to the parliamentarian and says, what's the rule, Mr. Parliamentarian? The parliamentarian turns and tells him, hold your breath, parliamentarian. He's not going to look to you because he knows what you would say. He would say, this is not parliamentarily appropriate. You cannot change the Senate rules by a pure majority vote. So if any of you think I'm exaggerating, watch on television. Watch when this happens. And watch the vice president ignore. He's not required to look to an unelected officer. But that has been the practice for 218 years. He will not look down and say, what is the ruling? He will make the ruling, which is a lie about the rule. Isn't what really is going on here? The majority doesn't want to hear what others have to say, even if it's the truth. Senator Moynihan, my good friend who I served with for years, said, you're entitled to your own opinion, but not your own facts. The nuclear option abandons America's sense of fair play. It's the one thing this country stands for, not tilting the playing field on the side of those who control and own the field. I say to my friends on the Republican side, you may own the field right now, but you won't own it forever. And I pray God when the Democrats take back control, we don't make the kind of naked power grab you are doing, but I'm afraid you will teach my new colleagues the wrong lessons.
Used about one thing here. There is no question, coming from a family that had been, unfortunately, an excessive consumer of medical health care expenses, how someone can be absolutely crippled by these medical expenses. There's no question about that in my view. Where I have difficulty trying to figure out is
should the irresponsibility of the federal government and the state government thrust upon the creditor? And what confuses me is, let me move away from healthcare for just a moment. There's an awful lot of people in the National Guard right now who are being sent overseas. They have jobs where their combined income of the husband and wife may be $80,000, $90,000 a year. But when the person, the male or female who is sent overseas, called up by the National Guard or the Reserves, maybe was making $60,000 a year, is now, based on their rank, making $24,000 a year. They have the same car payments, they have the same house payments, they have the same tuition payments, they have the same bills. My question is, if they cannot pay those bills because of an extended tour, which many are going through, and they have to declare bankruptcy, should the creditors who have lent money to them based upon their initial income, should they be the ones that pay the cost, in effect, of their inability to pay? Or is that a larger responsibility of the public at large? And that's what confuses me about your arguments, Professor Warren. They're very compelling. They're literally true. But in a sense, they beg the question. It seems to me that the federal government should be seeing to it that every American is put in a position where their health care costs are such that if in fact they have these extraordinary expenses, that it's a social responsibility of the community to help them, as opposed to the social responsibility of the particular doctor or the particular bank that lent the money or the particular creditor who has put forward money assuming there was any ability to pay. I'm just in a philosophic question. Should anyone who has extraordinary medical expenses, unquestionably extraordinary medical expenses, should they be able to say, when there's an inability to pay all other bills, whatever they are, I mean, if they were going to pay those medical expenses, they wouldn't be able to pay any other bill, from the gas company to whomever. Is it a societal requirement we should write into the bankruptcy code that says that the gas company should subsidize the payment of those medical bills, that the local drugstore should subsidize the payment of those medical bills? Maybe we should. I mean, I'm being deadly earnest here, because you make a very compelling and mildly demagogic argument that talks about what is true. All of these things are true. And so my question is it from a philosophic standpoint, is it the responsibility of the gas company and the drugstore and whoever else you named to make sure that these people do not have to make these hard choices? Or is that a responsibility of the government or the people at large? And that's my only question I'll ask. Then I'm asking you, Professor.
Senator, I think you've put your finger on the heart of what the bankruptcy bill, or bankruptcy in general, not this bill.
No, forget bankruptcy. I'm asking a larger question. Forget
that's
about
what
bankruptcy.
I mean. It's the question of what role bankruptcy plays.
No, that's not my question. I'd like you to answer my question. What role is there under what you would consider to be an appropriate form of government where we legislate? Do we say that people who in good faith provide a service for an individual, that the individual is unable to meet because of a legitimately horrific and extraordinary dilemma that was an act of God, that who should be responsible for taking them out from under that crushing burden? Should it be the automobile company who lent the money to purchase a car, the drugstore that lent them money, that provided a service, in effect lent them money because there's a bill for the drug bill, the utility company, the guy who has the lawn service company. I mean, whose responsibility is it? Because that's really the question. Because if you buy onto this argument, which is very compelling in my view, you're saying the creditors should be the ones to buy on to that philosophically enshrined in a piece of legislation obligation. That's my question.
Senator, I think you're exactly right. And that is that we need fewer families to need to turn to the bankruptcy system. We have a broken healthcare finance system in the United States.
Right.
And all I can do is point out that it is bankrupting families.
Absolutely right.
Until we fix the broken healthcare finance system,
right,
those families have to turn somewhere. And that means now they turn as a last-ditch effort to the bankruptcy
right.
court.
And that means they turn to asking the people that they borrowed money from to pay for their health care cost, right?
Senator, the cost...
Isn't that literally correct?
It is literally correct
Thank
that
you.
the cost of a broken healthcare system are borne throughout the economy.
We are asking, and I may be ready to do this. We're going to ask the gas company, the drugstore, the automobile dealer to pay for the broken system, instead of having the nerve to come and say it's a moral obligation of a nation to pay for that broken system. Why should it be someone who sits there living in a $2 million home for whom it lent no money to that person? Why do they not have an obligation to pay for that, instead of the guy who owns the drugstore at the corner pay for that? That's my only point. Let's just be honest what we're doing here. And it may make sense, and I might add for the record, I'd like to put in the record a Forbes article, and I'd like to ask you whether it's an accurate quote, Professor. They quote you in an article entitled "Everybody Knows It's Credit" in Forbes magazine, saying, quote, "The lobbyists are going to be the only ones who really profit," scoffs Elizabeth Warren, Harvard law professor. I think you're dead right, because it points out in here, as you point out, we have to find new boogeymen. The one people who aren't going to benefit under this are the credit card companies, as you point out in here. I submit this to the for the record. I'd invite any response in writing from anyone who'd like to respond to the article. We'll make it available to you. Okay? But I just think we should be honest about this thing, and we're making the gas company, which I don't like the gas company. I don't like many companies, but anyway. Pay is, we just ought to acknowledge what we're doing here when we make these kind of assertions.
Thank you, Senator Biden. Can Professor Warren just respond to the quote? She was legend. Would you want to just respond to the quote? Okay.
I think the senator makes an entirely fair point about externalizing the cost, and I would add only one caveat to it. Not only does this bill treat all debtors alike, in many ways it treats all creditors alike. The gas company doesn't have the capacity to change its pricing to reflect these risks, or has very limited capacity. But I remind you of what the credit card companies have already...
Should it? It implies they should.
No,
should the gas company be required to change the prices to reflect these?
No, of course they should.
Oh, okay.
Senator.
Well, the way you stated, you said they don't have the capacity. The implication is maybe they should have that capacity.
My point is the losses will go to some creditors who cannot reflect this in their prices. But look at the cases cited in my testimony, where credit card companies, I have a specific case, in Ray McCarthy, but nothing unusual about it. A woman who borrowed $2,200. The credit, she paid back $2,100 over the 2 years preceding bankruptcy. And at the end of that period of time, she was told she still owed $2,600. With fees and interest, I submit, Senator, that there are many in the credit industry right now who are getting their bankruptcies prepaid. That is, they have squeezed enough out of these families in interest and fees and payments that never
Maybe we should
paid
talk
down.
about usury rates then. Maybe that's what we should be
Senator,
talking about, not bankruptcy.
I'll be the first. Invite me.
No, I know you will, but let's call a spade a spade. Your problem with the credit card companies is usury rates from your position. It's not about the bankruptcy bill.
But, Senator, if you're not going to fix that problem, you can't take away the last shred of protection from these families.
Okay. You're very good, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Senator Biden.
This has been one of the deadliest weeks of the war for U.S. soldiers. 32 have been killed since Monday, most of them in attacks in western Iraq near the town of Haditha. Now, we went into that area 3 months ago and cleared out all the insurgents at the loss of 3 Marines. Then we had to come back and have taken heavy losses again. Question, do we have enough U.S. troops in Iraq to take territory and then to hold on to it?
Absolutely not. We haven't had it from 2 years ago, a year ago, 6 months ago. I came back from Iraq after my 5th trip on Memorial Day. I met with every major general that was there. They all said they didn't have enough forces to mount a counterinsurgency, which means that you have to seal that border. When you take territory, you have to occupy it. These brave Marines go out in Anbar province, which is along the Syrian border out there. They clear out territory. They have to leave. It fills up again. We don't have enough troops.
Senator Biden, let me ask you something, because we've talked here about the fact that the Iraqis are slow in the training up, and we've also talked about the fact that there may not be enough U.S. troops there right now to meet the burden. But we're hearing from top U.S. officials talk about a possible drawdown next spring. Do you think that's realistic, and is it being driven by the situation on the ground in Iraq, or is it being driven by the political realities or political motivation, particularly the fact that there is a declining support here at home for the president's policy?
Well, I won't second guess their motive, the administration's motive, but the fact of the matter is that I think instead of talking about drawing down and a timetable to do that, I think we should be making clear to the Iraqi people what our objectives are. One is we should state forthrightly, we have no desire to have a permanent base there. 2, we have no desire to deal with their oil. We should be giving declarative statements to make clear to the Iraqis and broadcast it far and wide what our objective is, number 1. Number 2, we waited much too long to begin to train the Iraqis. You may remember, Chris, I've been on your show repeatedly saying that Rumsfeld was simply wrong, saying there were 220,000 Iraqis trained, then 156,000 Iraqis trained. We've misled the American people. We have lost their confidence. And now there's this race against time. Can we get a government up and running? Can they get a government up and running that has the capacity to maintain order before we lose the support of the American people? And we are... They're still not leveling with us.
When you say they're still not leveling with us, let me ask you a direct question, Senator Biden. How many Iraqi troops do you believe right now are adequately trained to take over from U.S. forces in all kinds of combat situations?
Fewer than 3,000.
Excuse me?
Fewer than 3,000 able to take over totally without U.S. support. There are then another probably 25 to 30,000 that with significant U.S. support are able to do very useful things. And then there's probably another 10 to 15,000 that are incapable of doing anything at this point.
Now, Senator Biden, I remember you said roughly that same number some months ago during the confirmation hearings.
That's exactly right.
For Secretary Rice. And Rumsfeld and some of the other people in the Pentagon said you're crazy.
They did say that, and I would just let history be the judge as to who is correct.
Senator Biden, your overview of where we stand in the writing of the Constitution and whether the center is holding or whether the various factions are splintering.
Well, I think the center can hold. It's remarkable it's gotten this far, but you've mentioned before, Chris, that these 3 things that Dick just mentioned, that is federalism, allocation of resources, that is oil, and the Sharia's role in the Constitution, we knew that for the last 2 years they would be the sticking points. This is the really hard part right now. This is the most critical moment in modern Iraqi history, how those 3 get resolved, and that will determine whether or not there is a real real shot of this country holding together, or we begin to see fissures that essentially result in the Iraq turning into Lebanon. I still am hopeful. I wish we had done what we did in Bosnia. I wish we had brought in the rest of the world that was prepared to be involved in the political process, like we did with the contact group in Bosnia, so that we weren't the one looking like we were pushing the Constitution in a particular direction. We have one of the most skilled ambassadors in my 32 years in the United States Senate in place now in Iraq. He's doing a brilliant job, long overdue, a brilliant job. But I wish we were able to bring collective pressure so that it wouldn't be us dictating, appearing to be able to be used as dictating outcomes. That's my greatest concern.
Senator Biden, we're running out of time, and I want to ask you and Senator Lugar a couple of brief questions. First of all, let's turn to Iran. There are reports just yesterday that, according to top U.S. intelligence, that some of the more powerful, more sophisticated bombs that are being used against us in Iraq apparently were being made and shipped in from Iran. When you add this to Tehran's refusal to accept the European incentives to stop its uranium enrichment program, what should we do about Iran?
Well, there's two things. One, we have to, on the nuclear side, we have to stay in sync with the Europeans in the hope that if they do not respond, the Iranians, that we will collectively be able to respond with additional sanctions, because as the president says, we're sanctioned out. On the latter part, it seems to me that we have to do something that's going to sound heretical here. What did we do in Bosnia and what did we do in Afghanistan? We looked at a regional approach to both of those problems. In Bosnia, we got the Croats and the Serbs in to deal with the Dayton Accords. In Afghanistan, we actually brought in the Iranians as part of the solution there initially. We need to be able to figure out how we make assurances and how we deal with the border states around Iran. There's no discussion, to the best of my knowledge, going on any of those things. It seems to me that that's a mistake. That our large military presence in Iraq is both necessary and increasingly counterproductive. Our presence remains necessary because right now our troops are the only guarantor against chaos. Pulling out prematurely, in my view, would doom any chance of leaving Iraq with our core interest intact. But our large presence is also increasingly part of the problem. 2 years ago, or even 1 year ago, the Iraqis were prepared, and remember these polling results, Iraqis were prepared to accept an even larger American presence, if that's what it took to bring security and real improvement to their daily lives. But our failure to do just that has fueled growing Iraqi frustration, and a liberation is increasingly felt as an occupation.
I want to, on the question of Democratic Party mainstream issues where you're going to be judged by potential voters in the primary. Tell me about abortion. Where do you stand, and how will you face that issue as a candidate?
It's going to be very difficult. I do not view abortion as a choice and a right. I think it's always a tragedy, and I think that it should be rare and safe. And I think we should be focusing on how to limit the number of abortions, and there ought to be able to have a common ground and consensus as to do that. I think the vast majority of the American people think that can be done, but unfortunately, we're put in a position you either eliminate abortions under all circumstances, or it's, quote, abortion on demand. The fact of the matter is I've never known of a woman having an abortion and say, by the way, I feel like having an abortion. It's always a tragic decision made, always a difficult decision. And I think we should focus on how to deal with women not wanting abortions. I might point out, when there was economic prosperity and growth, the number of abortions went down by 300,000, if I'm not mistaken, during the Clinton administration. And they've gone up during the Bush administration, in large part because of the economic stress and pressure placed on people who become pregnant. And so we should be focusing on how to make it more hospitable for women to want to carry a child to term than we should be on eliminating under any circumstances the woman to be able to make that choice about whether or not to carry to term.
This week, the Supreme Court, with Samuel Alito in his seat, took the late-term partial birth abortion case.
Well, I'm a bit of an odd man out in my party. I do not vote for funding for abortion. I voted against partial birth abortion. to limit it, and I vote for no restrictions on a woman's right to be able to have an abortion under Roe v. Wade. And so I've made everybody angry. I've made the right to life people angry because I won't support a constitutional amendment or limitations on a woman's right to exercise her constitutional right as defined by Roe v. Wade. And I've made the group, the women's groups and others very angry because I won't support public funding and I won't support partial birth abortion.
Well, sometimes making everybody angry is okay.
Well, let me put it this way. One of the things I decided a long time ago, and it's going to sound corny, but you have to be happy with yourself. You have to be able to look in the mirror. And I think what I'm doing is right. I have my own personal views on abortion, but my view of imposing my views that I accept on faith based on other God-fearing people seems to me to be not what my sworn oath is to do. And so for me, keeping government out of it completely is the way to do it. But I think we should get government into it to change the circumstance where it's more hospitable for women to decide to carry to term rather than to abort.
All right. You mentioned faith.
Well, the president, though, said yesterday, we're not listening to the phone calls. We're just looking for patterns.
Harry, I don't have to listen to your phone calls to know what you're doing. If I know every single phone call you made, I'm able to determine every single person you talk to. I can get a pattern about your life that is very, very intrusive. And the real question here is, what do they do with this information that they collect that does not have anything to do with al-qaeda? There's a whole deal when you talk about this kind of stuff where under the law they're supposed to demonstrate that they're getting rid of and not keeping any extraneous information that they pick up on wiretaps and or pick up in sweeps like this. And the president's saying, I think I wrote down, he said, this is not mining or trolling. Mm-hmm. If it's true that 200 million Americans' phone calls were monitored in terms of not listening to what they said, right, but to whom they spoke and who spoke to them, I don't know. That's the Congress should investigate this.
As you know, I got a lot of support from this Indian. That's where more to come, I think. So. No, I've had a great relationship. In Delaware, the largest growth in population is Indian Americans moving from India. You cannot go to a 7-Eleven or a Dunkin' Donuts unless you have a slight Indian accent. I'm not joking. Oh, gigantic.
I was smart enough and talented enough to find and hire Nelson. He was smart enough and talented enough to leave and go make a whole hell of a lot of money so he could help contribute to my campaign, and I appreciate it very much. Hey folks, thank you very much. Let me thank Simon and the whole group here for bringing a voice and a perspective that our party has to, I think, and I'm not being solicitous, has to be sort of the lead tone and tenor if we're going to take back the United States Congress and if we're going to win the presidency in the year 2008. It is true that there are I've been there 34 years. It is true there are only 4 senators who are more senior than me. But it's very important to you to understand there's 44 still older than me. 44 still older. That's the only important fact I want you to remember. Folks, look, I did not realize that I had this opportunity until earlier today, and I apologize for being a few minutes late. We were debating Iraq, and then the leadership asked whether I'd join them in a press conference after the resolutions that we voted on. And I'll try to do 2 things in very short order, and I know you haven't been taking questions. With your permission, I'd rather stop at some point here and take questions, if that's okay, if you have the time. And if you don't have the time to do that, I'm delighted to leave. There's that old joke, my job is to speak and yours to listen. If you all finish your job before I finish mine, raise your hand and we can all get the hell out of here. I think I'm obliged to make just a few comments about Iraq. And I'm confident if you're a Democratic audience, there's a split view on Iraq, that there are differences in whether we should have gone in, whether we should have given the president the power, whether the war is reached a point that is beyond redemption, and whether or not there is still a requirement that we try to salvage our security interest. And Democrats are divided on that. But one thing we're not divided on, how badly this administration has bungled the war. I don't think it's hyperbole to suggest that, absent another serious mistake like Iraq, which Iran would be in my view at this moment, but absent that, I think that the conduct of the war in Iraq, how it started, when it started, and the way it's been conducted, is going to go down in American history as one of the most significant foreign policy mistakes this country has made in the last 100 years. And that's not an exaggeration. I am not exaggerating. I'm not, I think I'm stating what will become a historical fact. Hopefully it's a historical fact, because God willing, nothing else as bad is going to happen in terms of mistaken judgment. But, you know, Karl Rove, I was on Meet the Press or some program last weekend. I can't remember which one, but anyway, I was on one of them with Lindsey Graham. And Lindsey Graham, who basically agrees with me in most of all my criticism, and he has up to now, all of a sudden it was Lindsey the Tiger. You know, the program got over and we're hooked up. I'm in Wilmington and we're on the IFB, and I said, Lindsey, I guess you got the memo, huh? Because the Rove memo went out. And the way these guys are trying to deal with their absolute abject leadership in Iraq is to try to point out how we're divided. An unsolicited piece of advice you're obviously not asking for, but you are prominent in your communities, you are influential within the party. I would suggest we come up with a similar single line that they have, like they're using. The Republicans are totally united on this issue, unlike any other, from immigration through the economy. They're totally united on the president's mishandling of the war in Iraq. They're united in a failed policy, and they are. It's a failed policy that has one small prospect of being able to be redeemed, even at this late hour. Redemption meaning that we leave Iraq when we leave Iraq with a relatively secure government within its existing borders, not a threat to its neighbors, not a haven for terror, and not engaged in an all-out civil war. That's as good as it will get, if it gets that good. If God came down and gave me that option right now, I would take it. Because the idea of establishing a democracy in Iraq was never real, in my view, in terms of a liberal democracy. And from the outset, I've said that. But we are risking, with this present policy and the failure to alter strategy, we are risking having traded a dictator for chaos, a civil war, and a possible regional war, where our interest will be implicated for a long time. I ran and got elected in 1972. A press person in Delaware reminded me a year ago that I had said in the last debate, I'm so certain that the policy upon which Vietnam is premised is mistaken, that if in fact a Russian fleet ever docks in Cameron Bay, I will offer my resignation on the floor of the United States Senate. Literally, that's how certain I was that there's no geopolitical consequence for us leaving Vietnam. I'm equally as certain, if we must leave Iraq because there's no option, and we're going to know that pretty soon, that we will leave behind a legacy we're going to have to deal with for the better part of the next 2 decades. I'm the guy, unlike anybody else, who said before we went in, if we went into Iraq, oil would go to $60 a barrel. Remember they were talking about $10 a barrel and how this would be unified and be certain, so on and so forth? I'm telling you now, if we don't straighten up our policy, if we don't get a Sunni buy-in to their constitution, if you do not purge the military and the police force of sectarian forces, if you do not come up with a policy how to begin to control the militia, and if you do not keep the neighbors out, oil will be $120 a barrel. I know, I've been in Washington long enough to know you shouldn't say things like this because you know this is going to be told, you're going to be reminded of it. But if this ends up in a full-blown civil war, resulting in a regional war, which is probable if it's a full-blown civil war, you will see oil spike to $120 a barrel. And then we got already on the bad economic policy this administration is fostering a disaster. Enough about Iraq. And I'm happy to answer questions if you'd like me to. Second point I'd like to make, and I'll make it as briefly as possible. I don't think anyone can be the Democratic nominee and win the presidency without his or her ability to negotiate two threshold issues: security and faith. Security and faith. And secondly, once that is, if you can ante in that in the poker game, if you can't, you're out. It will not matter. It will not matter whether our candidate has the right policy on economic policy, on education policy, on health care policy. You don't get to go unless you can meet those two criteria, in my opinion. But once you do that, then unless we begin to figure out how to begin to rebuild the middle class and speak to the middle class, we're in deep trouble. They ain't voting for us, folks. They used to be our constituency. They're from whence I come. And although I ran for the United States Senate out of the civil rights movement, my state, to its great shame, was a slave state, segregated by law. We have the 9th largest black population in America. That's how I got involved. The fact of the matter, though, is that if you take a look at the last 20 years, name me a direct policy middle-class folks thought that we aimed at them. We say, well, college loans, or minimum wage, or job retraining. I don't know what neighborhood you all came from, but my middle-class neighborhood with a lot of split-level homes, none of that affect them, in their view. And we used to sit there and say in the Democratic caucus, oh my God, why do they know that Reagan and Bush 1 and now Bush 2, for certain, gives all the benefits to the corporations and the wealthy people, and the polling data shows the American people think that, and some of them still vote Republican. Why? In their bad tax policy, at least $800 to $1,600 to $2,500 drops out and trickles down onto the kitchen table. Name me a Democratic tax policy you've heard offered in earnest where anything bounces up from the floor onto the table. And although I got involved not because of the middle class, not because of the wealthy, but because of the poor and the disadvantaged, I said and got in trouble in my first campaign, I'm not running because the DuPont company needs me. I'm running because the east side of Wilmington, Delaware needs me. I'm running because the Puerto Rican community needs me. We didn't have a large Hispanic community then other than Puerto Rican. But you know what I figured out after all these years? There is no Head Start. There is no Pell Grant. There are no Pell Grants. There is no aid to education. There is no WIC program without the middle class. That is the consensus. Rich folks ain't going to take care of poor folks. They have never, ever, 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 ever done it. It's middle-class folks with a moral compass that says that's the right thing to do. And as they shrink, and they're shrinking, I fear the things I care about most are going to get lost. And that is the need for help for the disadvantaged, the dispossessed, and the desolate. And so, folks, we better be able to speak to them. And lastly, I don't think a Democrat can get elected unless he or she is genuinely optimistic. I say that again. I go to party caucuses and I listened to really bright people lay out. I listened to three of the brightest people I most respect on economic policy. They finished, all the Democrats were saying, only two Democrats, Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden, said, whoa, 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 whoa. I don't buy that. If I buy into that bleak assessment, I refuse to accept that. I refuse to accept it. I refuse to accept that we have to somehow acknowledge that we're sort of a Gary Hart 1984 campaign. We're consuming too much. Let us spank ourselves. We are to blame. We are the problem. I think the American people are tough. And I think all of Washington and both parties vastly underestimate the resolve of the American people. Vastly underestimate their resolve. They know every single problem we face is difficult, but they're not afraid to face them. They're just looking for somebody to say, here's the choice. Look, folks, crime rates are up. We're cutting local law enforcement. We're cutting the Biden crime bill. We're cutting out all those cops. I said, oh my God, where are we going to get them? How can we do this? If we just eliminated the $2.5 billion per year that we are giving oil companies to encourage them to invest when they made $35 billion. I had all 6 of the major oil companies before me in Judiciary Committee 3 weeks ago. Under oath, raised their hand. God bless Arlen. He made them be sworn in. I looked at the chairman of the board of ExxonMobil. I said, do you need that tax cut? And he started, I said, remember, you're under oath. Swear to God, somebody may have seen it. And he looked, and he was, oh God, he was angry. CEOs of oil companies aren't used to people asking them questions. I mean it sincerely. And he said, no, I don't need it. I went down the list, the other 5 CEOs. They said, we don't need it. I said, good. Okay, I said, I'm going to introduce a bill to take it away from you, to use it for other things. You support the bill? Oh, I thought he was going to burst. And he looked at me and he said, yes, yes. I went to the floor of the United States Senate. I couldn't even get a vote on it. Couldn't even get a vote on it because of the way it's controlled. But here's the point I make. You just eliminate that one single tax break. You can fund the entire cops bill. You can restore the $2 billion a year we've taken away from the states. You can change the uptick in crime. Because my crime bill worked. Violent crime came down 8.5% per year, every year, at the same time that the cadre of crime committing years went up. Folks, if you were to support research in Star Wars, eliminate the money to deploy it when it's not ready to be deployed now, to move against the 10th least likely threat our military thinks exists, and took that $6 billion, you know what you could do? You can inspect every single solitary cargo container, all 6 million of them, before they hit America's shores for a dirty bomb and a nuclear bomb. You could have 10 million doses of advanced radiation sickness vaccine available. You could add 1,000 FBI agents, which we are short on. You could add 13,000 new cops. You could turn around and you could guarantee the public's the physical safety of the 100 major chemical plants in America. You could do that. So folks, we ought to be square with the American people. Tell them the truth. Say, look, here's what our priorities are, right here. You don't like them, understand it. Vote for the other guy. You like them, vote for us. Folks, we can't solve the energy crisis in 2 days, but I'll tell you what we can do. And some of you are real experts. If you just passed the bill that Lugar and I introduced, mandating every automobile in America be fuel flex capable by 2008, it costs $55 a car. Technology's all there. Guarantee that everybody who owns more than 25 gas stations have at least 10% of those stations pumping E85 ethanol. And guarantee that you have 1 mile per year increase in mileage based on the weight of an automobile, not the CAFE standard we have now. Guess what? In 6 years, you have 20% more flexibility in your reliance on foreign oil. And guess what that's doing to us? I do know a lot about foreign policy, as much as anybody in this room, including if you're Henry Kissinger, who I love. Folks, we have mortgaged our foreign policy. Everyone's out there going, oh my God, how in God's name, you know, the Chinese came here and the president didn't get anything. Guess what? They own us. $175 billion. So folks, there's a lot we can do. But we can't do any of this unless we're willing to trust the American people. And what bothers me after 34 years in Washington, Democrats are getting like Republicans in one respect. They think the American people are stupid. They've never, ever, ever let their country down when they've been challenged. Not one single time in American history have average Americans let their country down. That's not nativism. That's not this beat our chest and my being xenophobic. It's a historical fact. And I conclude by saying that it's occurred. Every major step forward we've made as a nation has occurred in the immediate aftermath of a great crisis. In the immediate aftermath of a crisis. George Bush is going to be judged very harshly by American history. Not for the mistakes he's made, and he's made many, but for the opportunities he's squandered, repeatedly squandered. Just imagine, folks, if on September the 12th, Franklin Roosevelt had been president, or John Kennedy, or others you might think of. I imagine you would have heard, literally, not figuratively, imagine you would have heard a speech like this. My fellow Americans, we have been dealt a tragic blow. 3,000 of our fellow Americans have been murdered. Our economy is temporarily but seriously damaged. And there's a new rise of a threat that we haven't had to face before in human history, where something other than a nation state can existentially threaten our well-being. But folks, we'll overcome this like every other generation in history has. And by the way, I'm making two announcements today. I'm announcing that I've called a meeting for the major powers to meet in Brussels on October the 1st to begin to jointly plan the demise of the rise of Islamic fundamentalism. And I'm going to the United States Congress in 2 weeks. I'm introducing an energy bill to free us from the iron grip of the oil oligarchs, and I demand your support. Who would have said? Okay, I mean, I don't say it for an applause line. Ask yourself, I mean, literally, as we Catholics say, examine your conscience. Ask yourself, do you think anyone would have said no? Do you think anybody would have said no? What were we told? Literally, we were told, fly and go to the mall. Not figuratively, literally. Good things to do. And then we were told, in this generational war on terror, we are going to have the most significant tax cut in American history, and I'm now, watch me, going to divide the nation based on faith. Folks, we still have an opportunity. Everybody remembers 9/11. I'll tell you my most vivid image of 9/11. And I mean this literally, and I bet when I tell you, you'll remember it. It's after the towers came down. CNN, I believe it was, showed young people, they look like they're young people, look like they were young professionals between the ages of 25 and 40 or something, lined up single file in New York City, block after block as far as you could see. They were standing in line to give blood. And they stood there after they were told no more blood was needed. If that was not a silent scream saying, please let me help mend this country's broken heart, I don't know what was. Folks, don't give up on our people. Don't give up on the grit of the American people. They know these are tough problems, but they know they're soluble. Seamus Heaney, I'm always quoting Irish poets. My colleagues are kidding me about it all the time. They think it's because I'm Irish. I don't do it for that reason. I do it because they're the best poets. But Seamus Heaney wrote a poem that won the Nobel Prize for Poetry, I think in 96 or 7, mid-90s. And there's a stanza in it that, and the reason why poetry is so good, it more concisely states an intellectual notion and an emotion than prose can. And I think this sentiment lives in the heart of the vast majority of Americans. He said, history teaches us not to hope on this side of the grave, but then, once in a lifetime, that longed-for tidal wave of justice rises up, and hope and history rhyme. I believe with every fiber in my being after 34 years. We are poised like no generation has been for the last 60 years to change history on the margins. We have a shot at making hope and history rhyme, but it will not occur unless we're more straightforward, blunt, and demand more of the American people to deal with what they know to be the genuine crises and problems we face. They're up to it. The question is, are we up to it? Thank you for listening. If there's time, I'll take questions. As long as they don't, I'm not just leaving on them.
No. We've invited the senator back for questions another time.
You scare an employer in this country, whether he's an agricultural worker or a housewife, into not hiring an illegal because the punishment's so high that if you get caught, it's a huge embarrassment to your family, and you may just get hit with a fine that'll kill you.
Absolutely, you
can do that.
And that's what we should do. Well, I think we should do that.
Because you can't catch everybody.
You can't. No, you can't. And the last part of this is that the Democratic position also recognized you got 11 million illegal aliens here. They have to have a way to earn their way into the deal. This is an amnesty. They're required to take 11 years' worth. They pay a fine. They got to learn to speak English. They got to pass tests.
I like the English part.
Yeah.
I like the English part.
By the way,
if we want the problems of Canada right now, keep encouraging people to keep their foreign language. English is going to unite this country potentially. It always has in the past.
I can't think of a country that has 2 languages as their accepted languages that is doing all that well, including Switzerland and or Canada.
It divides us. Yeah. And you can't talk to each other. Anyway, thank you, Senator Joe Biden. We've solved it. You've done it.
A country that is an erstwhile democracy where they have the greatest disparity in wealth. It's one of the wealthiest countries in the hemisphere. And because of a corrupt system that exists in Mexico, there is the 1% of the population at the top, a very small middle class, and the rest is abject poverty. Folks, I voted for a fence. I voted, unlike most Democrats, and some of you won't like it, I voted for a 700-mile fence. But let me tell you, we can build a fence 40 stories high, unless it changes the dynamic in Mexico. And you will not like this. And punish American employers who knowingly violate the law when, in fact, they hire illegals. Unless you do those 2 things, all the rest is window dressing. Now, I know I'm not supposed to say it that bluntly, but they're the facts. They're the facts. And so everything else we do is in between here. Everything else we do is at the margin. The reason why why I believe the fence is needed is not related to immigration as much as to drugs. I'm the guy that wrote the National Crime Bill. I'm the guy that wrote the National Drug Act. I'm the guy that wrote the law that set up a drug czar. But let me tell you something, folks. People are driving across that border with tons, hear me, tons of everything from byproducts from methamphetamine to cocaine to heroin. It's all coming up through corrupt Mexico. So I would have, as they say in the southern part of my state, I'd have an altar call with those boys. I'd have a little come to the Lord meeting. You think I'm joking? I'm not joking. Any of you know about me. I've been doing this a long time. I've known every single major world leader in every country for the past 20 years. And I know a lot of them well because we came up like you guys do business. I've been a senator. There's only 4 senators spent longer than me in the history of the United States Senate. There's 44 senators. The bottom line, folks, is we got to level with these folks. Don't tell me in Mexico, do you expect to get the same kind of treatment that we give other democracies, and then you don't act in a democratic way? Not on my watch. Not on my watch. Yes, sir.
A lot of people declaring bankruptcy today are declaring bankruptcy middle-class people because of medical bills. That existed before the change and after. And so the question is, if you, in fact, are struck with a catastrophic illness, putting middle-class people in a position, and I'm a guy that had 2 cranial aneurysms, a major embolism. I was hospitalized 20 years ago for 7 months and recovering during that period. I was in ICU for 59 days. They gave me a 30% chance of living, and my bill was almost $1 million. Had I not had my wife's Blue Cross and Blue Shield, or my coverage, we used hers, but she's a school teacher in Delaware, guess what? Even as a successful lawyer, I would have lost everything. That's wrong. But it's not soluble within the bankruptcy bill. It is soluble by the need for a health care policy that provides catastrophic insurance for every single American. So they're never put in a position that they have to lose their entire savings, including their home in many cases.
Let me read you what Scott Ritter wrote on July 30th, 2002 about the hearings that you were just about to convene as head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. You were head of Foreign Relations at that time as well. For Senator Biden's Iraq hearings to be anything more than a political sham used to invoke a modern-day Gulf of Tonkin resolution equivalent for Iraq, his committee will need to ask hard questions and demand hard facts concerning the real nature of the weapons threat posed by Iraq. Ritter seems to have obviously been correct about this. Do you agree?
What's your question?
You agree that Ritter was right about that? That you presided over hearings, that you didn't ask the necessary
No, I don't agree with that. We did ask.
And in effect, wait for a Gulf of Tonkin resolution?
The answer is no, I don't agree with that. Your question, ma'am?
It's bizarre. Let me point out to you, I've said when the Baker Commission filed its report saying peace in Israel is related to Iraq, I was the first and only person in the Congress to point out, if tomorrow peace broke out in between Israelis and Palestinians, does anybody think there wouldn't be a full-blown war in Iraq? And conversely, if Iraq were transported to Mars, does anyone think there would not be the terrorism visited upon the Israelis every day? The difference between now and before 9/11, many Americans can taste what it must feel like for every Israeli mother and father when they send their kid out to school with their lunch to put them on a bus, on a bicycle, or to walk them. And they pray to God that cell phone doesn't ring. Every day. Every day. And so let's get it straight. Israel is not the cause of Iraq. Iraq being settled or not settled has nothing to do with Israel's conduct. And the second part is people should understand by now, this should be crystal clear, that Israel is the single greatest strength America has in the Middle East. I always say to my friends when they say those things to you, I say, imagine our circumstance in the world were there no Israel. How many battleships would there be? How many troops would be stationed? So I find it not only incorrect, but sometimes mildly insulting.
You said I could ask you the hard question.
You surely can.
In the American Jewish community, there is a certain sensitivity to the plight of Jonathan Pollard. You're running for president of the United States. If you win, it'll be a problem you'll have to face too.
Yes.
May I ask Joe Biden, what's his sense on what should be done now with Jonathan Pollard?
You know, I've been asked that question at the time Jonathan Pollard was arrested. Mm-hmm. One of the points that I think should be made is, if we don't want to play into the argument that Israel and Israelis and Americans who support Israel have dual loyalties, then you can't deal with Pollard. Mm-hmm. He has to serve his sentence.
He has to serve a sentence. Now, there's a rationale, in my view, why Pollard should be given leniency. There's a rationale for that. But there is not a rationale to say, no, what happened did not happen, it should be pardoned. And so I really do understand, but I was raised by what you would call a righteous Christian. At my dinner table, my father was a gentleman. He was a white-collar worker, high school educated, but a student of history and a devoted supporter of Israel. My father always resented the fact that anyone, particularly if you were a Jew who supported Israel, from back in '48 when the debates were going on in the Jewish community here in the United States, he could not understand how people could assume that because people understood that without an Israel, no Jew in the world was safe. He couldn't understand how that support could be translated into somehow being un-American. And my worry is that if I were president, to go and pardon Pollard, you didn't ask me that question, right, but to pardon Pollard would make a lie out of the notion that there are certain rules, period. You cannot give classified information, period, even to a friend. If this were Great Britain, it would be the same thing. And so the standard has to be maintained.
Okay.
Okay?
Have you ever been at a Seder?
I have.
Give me one Seder memory.
Well, I tell you, my son married a young woman whose mother and whole family is a very prominent Jewish family in the state of Delaware, the Bergers. And my probably most poignant Seder memory is not with the Bergers, but what happened right after I came back from meeting Golda Meir. And I had predicted that there would be that something was going on in Egypt. And I remember the poignancy with which we began the meal at that time. We began the meal with people talking about what it meant to them if Israel were actually defeated. And there is this inextricable tie between culture, religion, ethnicity that most people don't fully understand. That is unique and, how can I say it, so strong with Jews worldwide. There is a, I mean, I used to say early on when I was a kid, I'd say, when I was a young senator, I'd say, if I were a Jew, I'd be a Zionist. I am a Zionist. You don't have to be a Jew to be a Zionist. And that's the sense of vulnerability, which worries me.
You are remarkable, by the way, that you stayed here and spoke to every single one of us.
Well, they were kind to come.
Well, you're wonderful. So listen, the only thing I'll say to you is, if you become president of the United States, I want to be able to call, and you'll give me 2 minutes then to.
Absolutely.
Fair enough.
You got it. It's
Senator
a deal,
Joseph
Mark.
Biden.
It's a deal.
Thank you.
It's a deal. Thank you.
We'd love to know your response to this Shalom TV program. Please be in touch with us to share your thoughts and comments. You may do so by visiting our website at www.shalomtv.com or by writing us at Post Office Box 1989, Fort Lee, New Jersey, 07024. I'm David Shiraga. Thank you for watching Shalom TV.
We should have the courage to stand up and tell the administration they have had a god-awful policy. They have put our troops in a position that, in fact, has made it virtually impossible for them to succeed at the outset. They deserve a policy. They deserve a plan. There is no plan. We went to war with too few troops. We went to war unnecessarily. We went to war with these men and women ill-equipped. They're coming home ill-served. It's about time we have the courage to stand up and say to the President, Mr. President, you have not only put us in harm's way, you have harmed us. You have no policy, Mr. President. Mr. President, you're leading us off a cliff. Stop. I yield the floor.
I spent last summer going through the black sections of my town, holding rallies in parks, trying to get black men to understand it's not unmanly to wear a condom, getting women to understand they can say no, getting people in the position where testing matters. I got tested for AIDS. I know Barack got tested for AIDS. There's no shame in being tested for AIDS. It's an important thing, because the fact of the matter is, in the community's engaged in denial. They're engaged in denial. No one wants to talk about it in the community, and we do not have enough leaders in the community and outside the community demanding we face the reality, confront the men in the community, as well as the women, letting them know there are alternatives.
Thank you. Travis?
So the first and foremost thing is end the war in Iraq. Only one way to do it. Only one way to do it. You have to jettison the central thesis of Democrats and Republicans in the United States Congress in Washington. We're faced with a false choice. The choice is either more of the same and hand it off to the next guy, or leave and hope for the best. When even those who are saying leave and hope for the best, what are they hoping for? What do they say to you when they say that? When they answer, then what? They think if we leave, somehow you're going to get the sectarian warring factions together to form a central government in Baghdad that's democratic. Ladies and gentlemen, not in the lifetime of anyone in this room, and I've said this before the war, not in the lifetime of anyone in this room is there a possibility of a central democratic government in Baghdad, trusted by the factions making up this polyglot country called Iraq. So you must decentralize. You must separate the parties within the context of a limited federal government. You must give them control over the fabric of their daily lives, starting with their own physical security. If you do not do that, in my view, there is zero possibility. So when everybody says you need a political solution, ask them, what is their political solution? Not their tactical suggestion. What is the political solution? And so I think it's, you know, you can go on, I'm not being facetious, my website, joebiden.com, and get excruciating detail about what I think the political solution is. But it's pretty basic, folks. Never am I aware of any time in modern history where there's been a self-sustaining cycle of sectarian violence. Has it ended other than one of four ways? One side wipes out the other, a chance we cannot take, reigniting a Shia-Sunni conflict that could go from the Mediterranean to the Himalayas. Impose a dictator, which would be the ultimate irony for the United States of America. Occupy, which takes a generation or more and it's not in our DNA, or a federal system. Let's get on with it. Let's get on with it.
Why does a person even want this job now? Because whoever gets it really is inheriting quite a mess.
You know, Dave, if you ever wanted to be president, this is the time to be president, because you literally have a chance that only occurs about every 60, 70 years in American history. You got a chance to literally change the direction of the world. And if we keep going the direction we're going, we're in real trouble. And the rest of the world, I know most of these other world leaders, not because I'm important, I've just been hanging around a long time. I've gone to meetings with them when they were young parliamentarians and now running their countries. And they're desperately looking for somebody who can reestablish America's place in the world. And I think it's available. I think the American public is ready to do great things. They're not afraid of any of these challenges.
And how's your health now? Everything good?
As I flew over to meet with Milosevic in Belgrade, I said I would meet with him on one condition. It would not be in public, because I didn't want to give him the status of having a highly elected U.S. representative being seen shaking his hand in public, to give him that credibility. So I met with him, which was, they accepted my conditions at 10 o'clock at night in his office. And I sat at a table that was no wider than this is round, a conference table in his office, and began a discussion about what was happening in Srebrenica, where there was a massacre going on. And I was convinced of it. And he went on and on with all these maps about, no,
It was the Bosniaks. They were shelling themselves to get sympathy from the world. It wasn't the JNA, the Serbian army. It was, in fact, and went on and on. Finally, at one point, he could tell I was disgusted with him. And he looked at me and he said, Senator, by the way, he had a PhD, spoke perfect English, and was a brilliant guy. Cool as a cucumber. He looked like a mafia don. This guy was very, very well dressed, very smart, and very under control. And he looked at me, Mr. Mayor, and he said, Senator, in perfect English, what do you think of me? And all I could think of was my dad. And I looked at him and I said, Mr. President, I think you're a damn war criminal. And I'm going to spend the rest of my career seeing that you are tried as one. So help me God. And there were witnesses with me in that time, at that time, 2 staffers, one of which is here. And he looked at me like most thugs do. And he looked at me as if I had said, lots of luck in your senior year. He did not move. And we went on.
Why can't they stop taking money out of Social Security? They're always pulling it out for something. I think Ronald Reagan at the time, when he was president, he took it up to $88,000, the cap. The cap needs to be taken off that. These fat cats that make all this $100,000 and above don't pay any more Social Security.
You've raised 2 questions. I'll answer them very quickly. Number 1, we should not be raiding Social Security. Remember all that talk in the Gore-Bush campaign about a lockbox? On September the 10th, 2001. You can go to my website, joebiden.com. I'm not Monday morning quarterbacking. I made a speech to the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. And in that speech, I predicted that there'd be a massive attack on the United States of America. And I said it would come in the belly of a plane. I did not say it would come. And the point of my speech was I was taking on the President of the United States' misappropriation and misapplication of American tax money. He was spending and committing to spend $1 trillion on Star Wars. The least likely threat America faces is an ICBM missile carrying a thermonuclear warhead traveling 18,000 miles through the stratosphere, aimed at the United States with a return address on it. That is the least likely threat. And I laid out in stark detail, I'm not making this up, go look. This was the day before 9/11, to the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. Folks, it ain't because I see what you're saying.
So then what?
No, there's a lot of then whats. There's a then whats in terms of in terms of keeping a commitment to the veterans coming home. We should be expanding the hospital, not reducing it.
Trying to help them on the other side.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And it's a big deal. That's going to be $1 trillion requirement. Because these kids are, as you know, more of these kids come home with traumatic brain injury than any war since World War II. So, no, then we'll be able, at least we'll have the people to do it.
The good thing is it's job security, but the bad thing is shouldn't have that job security to help our kids.
Well, we're going to change that piece. Thank you.
I want to know about your health care plan. You have, did I get on your internet?
Yes, you can, but I can tell you that, first of all, I support universal health care. I think we should have it, and I think it comes in 3 stages. And the way to do it is start off right away and make sure we provide health care for children in catastrophic to build a consensus in this country, because the real problem is going to be taking on those insurance companies. Because they're going to be the ones, you're going to have Harry and Louise. Remember those ads with Harry and Louise out there saying, this is awful what the Democrats are proposing. And so the second thing is you got to provide for, I think everyone should essentially be able to be, from age 1 on, essentially have the same kind of coverage you have in Medicare. It should be just universal, across the board. We can afford to do that.
I know young people. I just had a young man paint my house. He did a beautiful job. He has no health care.
None.
He's 42 years old, and he says, it costs me
can't afford it.
$500 a month. He said, there's no way.
He can't afford it. He can't afford it.
Unless you go to work for a company,
you got it.
people are lost.
That's why we got to get them immediately coverage for the big stuff. You could do that quickly. Said anything, God forbid he fell off the ladder and were paralyzed, it would cover it. As opposed to...
The only thing you can rely on is that the Sunnis and the Shias and the Kurds are not going to let anybody from any other faction
ever police or ever be a political force in their area. That's the only thing you can rely on. So the sooner we get about setting up a decentralized federal Iraq, that their Constitution calls for, the better chance we have of leaving without leaving chaos behind. But we must begin to bring our combat troops home now. This is bizarre. Admiral Fallon is correct. We should be reducing by 2/3 to 3/4 quickly, immediately, in order to be able to have any semblance of a possibility of getting a political settlement based on a federal system. And you heard Corb before you talking about the need for a diplomatic initiative. This is bizarre. This is all about handing the war off to the next president. It's not about solving any problems.
At least some indication where the Secretary of State might be. One question, though, about the leadership in your own party. The Washington Post reporting today that many of the top Democrats in Congress are going to pursue moderate changes in Iraq policy in hopes of wooing some Republicans from the other side of the aisle. What is the point of compromising, though, if the president's going to veto anything he doesn't like anyway?
Well, that's kind of my point, Keith. I think there's 4 things we got to do. We got to pass legislation and make them veto it that begins to draw down American troops immediately, combat troops. I've been pushing that for a year and a half. We got to make sure that we change the mission, saying they can't be involved in the middle of the Civil War. Follow the recommendations of General Jones, who's probably the best soldier we've had in the last 15 years in command. Thirdly, we got to get about the business of providing for an agreement on a decentralized Iraq with a weak central government and get the international community to back it, which they're willing to do. That's what we got to do. That's the only shot of leaving anything intact. Otherwise, it's just chaos. And all this is a continuation of a god-awful failed policy. And I wish Bonnier rode home with me or was on the C-130. I was supposed to get on with what they call 6 fallen angels. 6 troops that have just recently been killed by roadside bombs. You tell their parents, you tell everyone else, this is worth it. There is no strategy here. As one of your colleagues said, all the American troops are being used for now is a cork in a bottle. They're not solving anything. They're just stopping things from getting a lot worse. I won't tolerate that, and the American people won't tolerate that.
In fairness to Mr. Bonnier, it was John Boehner who said that. And let's just clear that up.
Boehner, excuse me. I just heard it for the first time. Yes. Whoever made the comment, whoever made the comment is dead flat wrong.
Last point, is it... Not everyone does this, but Democrats often talk about failure in Iraq, failing to meet Mr. Bush's goals by that government. Would it be better at this point to spin the advice that President Johnson got famously about Vietnam and argue that we can bring the troops home now because they did do the mission that they were sent there for, which is to make sure we weren't threatened by Iraqi WMD?
If, in fact, I thought that would get them home, I'd do anything, even if it was as much of a sham as that. The truth is, we are going to have to get them out of there. There's no possibility of keeping them there. The sooner we begin to have them out, the better, and the more it increases the prospect that we can keep it from totally spinning out of control by working out a political agreement.
And now, sir, that does not seem to go in line with the return on success theme for tonight. Senator Joe Biden, Democrat of Delaware, candidate for president. Thank you, and we'll call on you again after the speech if that meets with your schedule.
Thank you. I'm happy to do that.
The president's address is at the top of the hour. An internet spoof is all ready for your consumption. Think Leave Britney Alone. And if we're already suspending belief that the surge is working, why not believe we can set water on fire? A quick cartoon break and more ahead on Countdown.
Let me show you what you said in Iowa last week. If we do not change course in Iraq soon, you're going to see 2 years from now helicopters hovering over our embassy in the green zone in Baghdad with people hanging onto the ladders just like Vietnam. Mark my words.
Absolutely, positively, unequivocally, I believe that. Look, let me tell you, Tim, there is no possibility of a central government governing Iraq in any near term. What I did see, the only place that anything has worked is when you've had local control, local police in local neighborhoods, local security, the ability of the local population to have control over the fabric of their daily lives, giving them breathing room so they can in fact have a central government that has 2 functions. 1, deal with the borders. 2, distribute revenue. Other than that, if you don't move to a decentralized federal system, there is no possibility, in my view, of success.
General Petraeus said in a letter to his troops that we have not had the political reconciliation we thought we would have at this time. It's been much slower, but there is some hope. And then he added this: my sense is that we have achieved tactical momentum and wrested the initiative from our enemies in a number of areas of Iraq. We are, in short, a long way from the goal line, but we do have the ball, and we are driving down the field. Is that what you expect him to say tomorrow?
I expect him to say that, and I really respect him, and I think he's dead flat wrong. The fact of the matter is that this idea of these security gains we made have had no impact on the underlying sectarian dynamic. None whatsoever. And when I met I'll tell you what I saw. I met with the two vice presidents, one Shia, one Sunni. Both agreed that the only way this is going to work is to give more local control. The only way it's going to happen. The only way there's any possibility of dealing with the sectarian violence is you got to separate the parties, give them some breathing room, give them local control. If you don't do that, Tim, you think we're going to get there in any way with this present government? And can anybody envision a central government made up of Sunni, Shia, and Kurds that's going to gain the trust and respect of 27 million Iraqis? It's not going to happen. They do care about their children, but over 200,000 parents have lost over 3,780 of their children. Over 27,884 of them been wounded. How many more fallen angels are we're going to have to sustain, how we're going to bring these bodies home before we end George Bush's war? And the fact of the matter is, George Bush has said something unconscionable. What he said last Thursday was, I have no plan to end this war. I'm handing it off to the next guy, next woman. Folks, you're looking at one of us going to have to end this war. One of us on this stage will have to end this war. And the next president's going to be left with virtually no margin for error. They better be smarter than their Secretary of State, and they better have the confidence of the American people because they have the depth and breadth of knowledge to be able to end it and do it without chaos. This. Look, it's not the plan, it's the man or the woman pushing the plan. If you look at all of our plans, there's not a whole lot of difference between them. We all talk about taking care of children, and some of us talk about catastrophic. We talk about being able to buy into the plan that all federal employees are able to buy into. But the fact is that it really is going to take someone who's going to be able to take on the insurance industry. They spent $250 billion last time with Harry and Louise to poke holes in the Clinton plan. They're going to spend $500 billion this time.
So in terms of letting the states try first.
I think what the states going forward does one thing. It helps begin to build a national consensus that the government involvement in this is not a problem. It's an asset. And the truth of the matter is we can do three things very, very quickly. We can insure every single solitary kid. We can provide catastrophic health insurance right off the bat. We can do that for the cost of just one thing. The tax cut for people in the top 1%. It's less than $85 billion a year. We can do that now. We're not going to get ourselves out of this by cutting interest rates. As a matter of fact, we're heading toward a recession if we don't begin to generate new jobs, we don't begin to invest in infrastructure, we don't begin to change the way we're approaching the economy. But let me go back to one of the things that hasn't been mentioned. One of the reasons why this is so severe, and no one saw it coming, is these hedge funds are unregulated. And the hedge funds out there went out there and they essentially bought up these mortgages. They're the ones going out and collecting on them. No one knew they owned all these things. We still don't know how much the exposure is. We don't have any idea. So there needs to be a whole lot more transparency. We didn't see this coming. Even notwithstanding, I agree with everything Chris said, but notwithstanding regulation, there was no way to know how these hedge funds bought up. How many did they have? $500 billion?
Whose fault is that, Senator?
Well, I think it's the fault of the failure to regulate. I happen to think they should be regulated. I think there should be transparency.
Congress?
Well, I think it's everybody's fault. I think it's everybody's fault. I think what happened was you started off with the idea you got to have about $1 million to get into one of these things, and they figured, well, they're all big boys. If they in fact lose their money, they lose their money, and so we don't have to regulate that.
that, like to protect small investors. But the flip side of that is, we didn't know what they were doing was going out and using these subprime mortgages they purchased based upon to go out to borrow more money, to go out to invest in things that were solid. And now all of a sudden what's happening, the reason why this is such a big deal, the people who they went out and bought stock in the XYZ Corporation, they borrowed money based on the fact they had these subprime mortgages that weren't so hot, and now what's happening? Now those guys are saying, whoa, 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 we want to collect on that. You don't have enough collateral there. And the whole economy, which Chris's point, is in a rippling effect here. Transparency is a big deal. Lobbyists aren't bad people. Special interest groups are not bad people. But guess what? They're corrosive. People who accept the money from them aren't bad people, but it's human nature. You go out, Lynn, and bundle $250,000 for me, all legal, and then you call me after I'm elected and say, Joe, I'd like to come and talk to you about something. You didn't buy me, but it's human nature. You helped me. I'm going to say, sure, Lynn, come on in. Just like, by the way, if I turn around and I'm elected President of the United States of America, and you call me and say, Joe, I want to come and see you, I'm going to see you. You helped me.
Well, this propaganda war that's been fought now for years now, the phrases like weapons of mass destruction that you and I never heard of growing up, regime change, all the rest of it, homeland, all the rest of the new language we've learned from this crowd that came in a few years ago. So around the late 90s, they started pushing this. If their motive is not to fight weapons of mass destruction, which don't seem to materialize when they're supposed to in either Iraq or the Iranian case, what is the grand motive for war? Why did we invade Iraq? Why were we threatening World War III with Iran? Why did this administration, Cheney and the president, keep pushing the war? Why do they always want to fight or scare somebody? What's it about if it's not weapons?
Let me tell you what I think it's about. I can't prove it. I think it's about our ability to try to dominate that region of the world and control oil. I don't think we went to war because of oil, but I think there was an absolute belief. The only thing I can fit together with Cheney and this gang is that they went to war. They're smarter than they are acting. They're smarter than they're acting. What they do, they went to war in the hope that they would be able to do two things. One, have a government that sat on a whole bunch of oil that still exists in the world that would be indebted to us. Two, have permanent military bases in Iraq to dominate that part of the world, to be able to control oil. Not to go steal it for American oil companies, but be able to control the price and control the access of it. A very Machiavellian view. There's nothing idealistic about Cheney. I don't know what President Bush thinks, but I think he's bought hook, line, and sinker the Cheney rationale that the only way for us to be able to be dominant in the 21st century is to use our overwhelming power in the face of the moral disapprobation of the rest of the world, threaten the rest of the world, and that's how we'd avoid war in the future. I think these guys are irresponsible, but the thing that angers me the most, and it angers me, Chris, is how incomprehensible it is for anyone to think that the president did not know, that his intelligence agencies didn't believe what he was saying. I believe that's why these guys came out with it now. 16 American intelligence agencies uniting, saying, I'm not going to wear the jacket again on this one. And I disagree with only one thing that Andrea said. The intelligence community didn't misread what was going on in a major way in Iraq. They misused the intelligence they were given.
Well, the trouble is the Senate has never gotten to that. I keep waiting for that second part of that intelligence analysis to show how it was manipulated. But I want to ask you about something you've been involved with. You said that if the President of the United States had launched an attack on Iran without congressional approval, that would have been an impeachable offense. Do you want to review that comment you made? Well, how do you stand on that now?
Yes,
do you think
I do. I want to stand by that comment I made. The reason I made the comment was as a warning. The reason I don't say those things lightly, Chris. You've known me for a long time. I was chairman of the Judiciary Committee for 17 years, or its ranking member. I teach separation of powers and constitutional law. This is something I know. So I got together and brought a group of constitutional scholars together to write a piece that I'm going to deliver to the whole United States Senate, pointing out the president has no constitutional authority to take this nation to war against a country of 70 million people unless we're attacked or unless there is proof that we are about to be attacked. And if he does, I would move to impeach him. The House obviously has to do that, but I would lead an effort to impeach him. The reason for my doing that, I don't say it lightly. I don't say it lightly. I say it because they should understand that what they were threatening, what they were saying, what was adding up to be, what looked like to the rest of the world what we're about to do, would be the most disastrous thing that could be done at this moment in our history that I can think of.
Senator Biden, you and your campaign have had a number of occasions to correct or clarify things you've said relating to race, including your remarks about Senator Obama being, quote, clean and articulate, your comment about Indians working at 7-Eleven, and recently to the Washington Post in which you spoke about race while describing disparities between schools in Washington, D.C. and Iowa. Do these gaffes or misunderstandings, or however you would characterize them, indicate you're uncomfortable talking about race, or are people just being too sensitive?
I think that I have my whole career. I got involved in public policy. I got involved in politics because of the civil rights movement. It's the overwhelming core of my support in my home state. I get the overwhelming majority, over 95% of the vote of minorities in my state. I may have phrased those things wrongly, but when I talked about the Indian population, what I was making the point was they're building families. They're coming by in businesses, 7-Elevens and Dunkin' Donuts and small shops, just like those Italian immigrants used to do, and they're building families. The point I was making about the inner city of Washington is the point that Barack just made. Barack made the point, he said that minorities start off at a disadvantage. They start off with a gap. An achievement gap that exists before they even walk into school, minorities. And so I was making the same point. It may be possible because I speak so bluntly that people misunderstand, but no one who knows me in my state, no one who I've worked with in the United States Congress has ever wondered about my commitment to civil rights and civil liberties. And if you take a look at my record as chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, of the Judiciary Committee, ranking member, chairman for 16 years, starting with the Voting Rights Act and worked its way through to voting against constitutional amendments on busing when busing was taking place in my state. My credentials are as good as anyone who's ever run for president of the United States on civil rights. You know, folks talk about this election being about experience or change. It's really about action and pragmatic solutions. And that's what I've done my whole career with the Violence Against Women Act, the crime bill, the Balkans, helping stop the genocide there. And ladies and gentlemen, you know, leadership is also about knowing who you are, what you believe, and what your priorities are, and what you'll do. In my case, I'll start by ending that war in Iraq, and also trust the American people. They're ready. They're ready to get up. There's a hymn in my church, our church, some of us here. It says, may he raise you up on eagle's wings and bear you on the breath of dawn and let the light shine on you. It's time to raise this country up. The American people are genuinely ready to do that.